Lyle is an assistant professor of medical microbiology at the University of Manitoba in Canada, a research associate at Caprisa in Durban, and a lecturer at the University of Nairobi. His research focuses on the mucosal immunology of HIV transmission and defining HIV risk in key populations, including female sex workers and men who have sex with men. He has published over 50 peer-reviewed publications and receives funding from the NIH, South African MRC, and Canadian Institute of Health Research. Please welcome Lyle.
Okay, so I'm very happy to present some highlights from Track A. I'd like to start by thanking my team who put a lot of work into covering this track with me. So Aida, Jeff, Renee, and Zaza, many thanks. So for an overview of Track A, we divided it into basic science that pertains to post-infection and pre-infection. And then this is further divided into sort of key themes in the conference, one being correlates of HIV acquisition, another being the HIV vaccine pipeline and correlates of vaccine protection. And then post-infection, given the increasing early delivery of ART, this field has shifted more towards looking at the latent HIV reservoir and opportunities for cure, and also a lot of studies that are pushing closer and closer to the most acute phases of HIV infection. So there was 57 talks in this track, and I'll try to at least pick out some highlights of a few of these. So a few speakers talked about the history of HIV vaccine efficacy trials, and particularly Larry Corey and Tony Fauci went through sort of comparing where we were at in 2000 in Durban, where there wasn't much vaccine research being done, to sort of how this field has unfolded over the years. And I'll spend a bit of time talking about three exciting studies that are coming up in the pipeline. And Tony Fauci also made some interesting points about empirical versus rational vaccine design. So, and he used the example of Maurice Hillman, who discovered a lot of vaccines empirically without any knowledge of immunology. And we can contrast this with the HIV field, where our knowledge of immunology has actually increased dramatically. So our ability to describe neutralizing epitopes on the envelope, for example. So we know a lot of this, but we don't know whether or not this is going to translate to an effective vaccine. So it was a very good sort of broad perspective talk. One of the big results that was presented was by Linda Gale Becker from Cape Town. And this is the HVTN 100 results. And this is the LVAC Clade C plus bivalent GP120 Clade C boost. And shown on the screen here is one of 4 GO criteria that was met in this trial. And that is the frequency of IgG binding antibodies to GP120. And you can see that in the green, these titers were actually higher than what was observed in RV144. And because these GO criteria were met, we now have a phase 2B3 trial starting in November, which will enroll over 5,000 individuals. 2 other speakers overviewed the P5 program, including the correlates track and the licensure track. And also another speaker overviewed the Janssen program, which is looking at a different sort of prime boost strategy and trying to evaluate which of these combinations might be the most useful to test in a larger efficacy trial. There was also some talks on new vaccine concepts, so how to get better immunogens for broadly neutralizing antibodies, replicating vectors, how to optimize breadth and durability. And a couple of the speakers from some of the sessions talked about how to get better V1, V2 targeting. This is a key correlate of vaccine protection. And also vaccines that can provide broader coverage. There was also some focus on passive vaccination, and particularly the AMP study, or antibody-mediated protection study, which will enroll over 4,000 individuals in multiple continents. And this is looking at the ability of a broadly neutralizing antibody, VRC01, given passively, and what concentrations of this antibody can provide protection. And Larry Corey gave a good overview on some of the lessons that can be learned from this study, namely what happens when you give these antibodies and what concentration is needed. And interestingly, these antibodies can also potentially have a role in cure research. So in terms of the cure field, a very good overview was provided by Debbie Prasad. And she made the point that we all know is that ART is not curative. And even though you get dramatic suppression of virus to undetectable levels, you can still grow virus out of these individuals. And the reason for this, of course, is the latent reservoir, which is the largest barrier to achieving an HIV cure. So HIV exploits immunological memory by staying in long-lived memory T cells. These cells are very difficult to identify. They're spread throughout the body, and they're very stable in that they can live for a very long time. And her talk focused a lot on early ART, particularly in children, because children often start ART within the first 2 months of infection. And therefore, they start with a smaller, lower diversity reservoir. And there are some interesting cases that suggest that these might be a good population to test cure strategies. In terms of a latent reservoir, there was a talk that really went into the ways that we measure the reservoir. And this is still a major issue, is that we don't have, we have many ways of measuring it, but we don't necessarily always know what these mean. So this is a very active field of research. So you can measure various DNA, HIV DNA, HIV RNA, and all of these measurements mean slightly different things. And of course, then you can also grow the virus, and some viruses are capable of growing out, and some viruses are defective. So this is still a very active field in sort of understanding what this important barrier is. And this just indicates that it has a cellular component, but it also has a tissue and a whole body component. Some clinical results on the top, in number 1, is the presentation by Jintanat from MHRP. And this was sort of disappointing in that it was a combination of ART plus 3 different drugs. And basically, you can see the rate of rebound was identical between the 2 groups. So the one group in red and one group in blue. So these were stably ART suppressed patients, and this treatment had no impact on their viral rebound. Another talk by Miles Davenport looked at another way of measuring the reservoir in non-human primates that might have important implications for how we monitor these types of trials. Another presentation by Anne-Marie Wensing is looking at an observational study of people who receive bone marrow transplants. And she presented data from 3 patients who have received bone marrow transplants and have very low, barely detectable levels of virus. And interestingly, 2 of the patients who had the lowest levels of virus also had concurrent graft versus host disease. So it's important to note that these patients are still on ART, and it's an observational study, but it's also an opportunity to understand a similar scenario as what we all know is the Berlin patient. Another presentation focused on an interesting study of the SA blood bank service in identifying very acutely infected patients who might be suitable for cure studies. There was also some new concepts in cure presented, and so I'll just highlight 3 of them here very briefly. One is looking at actually cutting out HIV out of infected cells using a system called CRISPR-Cas9, which is a very hot topic in molecular biology right now. And some of the sort of preclinical data was presented on this concept. Another concept is to remove CCR5, which is the important viral co-receptor. And there's some clinical studies and also a presentation on non-human primates. And this we know can potentially decrease the number of target cells for HIV and therefore decrease the reservoir. A third study was looking at also in non-human primates blocking a molecule called PD-1, which is a molecule both of the reservoir, a marker of the reservoir, and of exhausted T cells and B cells. So some promising data looking at how this combination of activating the reservoir and then augmenting immunity might be a possible cure strategy. And it's clear from all of these studies that more work is needed for them to realize their full potential. but they look promising. Switching gears a little bit to correlates of infection, there was a session that looked at HIV target cells and how these might lead to people having increased risk of HIV infection. So the first presentation was by Lenine Liebenberg from Caprisa, and she showed that HPV clearance was associated with a higher level of these HIV target cells in the female reproductive tract, the site of exposure in women. Similar data was shown by Doug Kwan from Regon that women who take injectable contraceptives have higher levels of these CCR5 target cells in the cervix. Similarly, Sinai Nkapu, saying that wrong, from Caprisa, showed that contraceptives increased the density of some of these target cells. Tom Hope showed some data that Th17 cells, which is a subset of helper T cells, is an important HIV target at the time of infection, both in the female reproductive tract and in the anal mucosa. And another presentation looked at the rate of dissemination following infection in the rectal mucosa and showed that actually the SIV AGM can disseminate very quickly within days following exposure. So this window of protection when it comes to target cells has to be very quick in terms of achieving prevention. A presentation from Caprisa looked at the effects of genital inflammation and looking at some of the causes and consequences of the microbiome. So this is the composition of bacteria in the female reproductive tract, which was associated in the upper left with a high rate of increased cytokines. So it looks like these bad bacteria might drive high cytokines, which we know is a surrogate of infection risk. And a presentation by Adam Bergener looked at how having a lactobacillus dominant or a good environment in the female reproductive tract versus a bad environment impacts the efficacy of tenofovir gel. So women who take the gel often, who have this good bacteria environment, have a much higher efficacy compared to those women with a bad bacterial environment. And then further sort of underlying causes of these effects were shown in that people with bad bacteria have more of this molecule called LPS, which we know is a driver of innate inflammation in the mucosa. And a presentation by Nikki Klatt showed that the part of this effect shown on the left might be driven by how bad bacteria affect the PK of tenofovir in the environment. So collectively, these studies really show the impact of the microbiome and how this might be important for as a determinant of HIV risk and also of tenofovir efficacy. There's a few presentations on the importance of the gut or the gastrointestinal tract as an HIV reservoir. So Jim Arthos showed in a non-human primate model that blockade of gut homing reduced the amount of HIV in the gut and also led to long-term effects of restoring mucosal CD4 cells, which is key to maintaining gut health. So this might be an important therapeutic strategy that could be used in HIV infection. J.P. Rudy showed that similar to Tom Hope, that the CCR6 positive cells or the Th17 cells might be an important reservoir. So you find higher levels of virus in these cells. And work by Nikki Klatt showed that, moving on beyond these target cells, that other cells are important in the mucosa. So she looked at different subsets of neutrophils and how these neutrophils interact with the bacteria at this site. So I just have one last slide, and this is getting back to the basic science implications of treating early. So one presenter looked at the rate of viral evolution and showed that in an individual treated early, after 16 years, there was very limited evolution, suggesting that in the gut, this treatment can really suppress virus, at least in this individual. Zaza Ndlovu showed that in very early treatment in the fresh cohort, you can actually prevent seroconversion in a lot of participants, suppressing viral load, and these individuals retain a lot of their CD8 positive T cell functions. Lastly, there was a couple of studies that looked at predictors of disease progression in very early infection, including exhaustion of CD8 T cells, and interestingly, getting back to the reservoir, the splice patterns of RNA. And Talia Mota also had a talk on this and how these splice patterns might influence cure strategies. So that's a very quick run through of this track. And I just want to put a slight plug in for R4P in Chicago, where more of this will be presented in more detail.
Thank you, Lyle. Great work. I can't imagine how difficult it was to do that summary over such a broad array of data. I have the privilege of introducing now Juan Ambrosioni. Juan obtained his medical degree in 2001 and infectious diseases specialty in 2006 from the University of Buenos Aires, Argentina. He worked in the HIV unit and infectious diseases service of the University of Geneva Hospitals, Geneva, Switzerland, between 2008 and 2013, joining the Hospital Clinic Infectious Diseases Service, Barcelona, Spain, in 2014. He has been involved in epidemiological, basic, and clinical research in HIV and infectious diseases in Argentina, Switzerland, Madagascar, and Spain. He has published nearly 100 peer-reviewed articles and book chapters, and is reviewer of several main journals of infectious diseases and clinical microbiology. Please welcome our Track B lead rapporteur, Juan Ambrosioni.
Can you put this also? Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I would like to thank the organizers for the invitation to give this talk today and cover the Track B. This is the team that has been working with me all this week very hard. So thank you very much to Stephanie, Sipo, Olivier, and Graeme, and also to Alexandra Calmi, who was supposed to be the lead rapporteur for this track, but she finally couldn't attend the conference. So this is the content I will try to follow. It's very hard to only present 12 minutes of clinical science of such a big conference. But I will try focusing in some very interesting presentations regarding specific populations. There were very interesting works on pregnant women, on incarcerated persons, on MSN, but I will focus on adolescents. Why on adolescents? Because with the success of mother-to-child transmission prevention, pediatric HIV is increasingly an adolescent and young adult epidemic. And also because it's the only group for which mortality is increasing. As you can see in this figure from a presentation on Tuesday, this is data from South Africa. This is the number of pediatric patients on ART, and in green is the figure for 2014. Most of these pediatric patients are now adolescents. From the same presentation, what is a warning is that adolescents have the lower suppressed rate among all the pediatric patients. That decreased from 74% for patients under 9 to 62% for adolescents. So with this problem of adherence and this increase in the proportion of detected adult patients, there could be an increase in transmission and an issue that is drug resistant. These patients have a lot of problems of adherence, and several studies have addressed the problem of drug resistance among adolescents. So the transition to adult care is a very critical period, and in particular, some studies have shown clearly that there is an increased mortality among pediatric patients aged 14. As it can be seen in this figure, here you have the year of birth and then the rate of death. And as you can see from data from Thailand and Europe, adolescents or children older than 14 have the higher mortality rate. So it's really a very key growing population that we need to address. I will move now to probably the most important part of my presentation, which is the news on ART. There were a lot of very important trials, so I will focus on what I thought was the most important, most relevant. And I will talk about 2 trials in naive population. This one is the OneSMART trial that compare the standard dose of ralteravir, the classic dose of 400 milligrams BID, to a reformulated ralteravir given a 1200 dose QD in both arms with tenofovir and amtricitabine. That was for naive patients, and as you can see, both arms worked pretty well and pretty comparable with the suppression rates that were really, really the same. And also, safety was comparable in this study, so this is an important trial, I think, because ralteravir is a very well-known drug. We have used ralteravir for more than 8 years, so it can be a very interesting add to armamentarium for naive patients, given once daily and with the lowest potential for serious drug-drug interactions. The other trial I want to mention for naive patients is the ARIA trial that was presented on Thursday. That trial compared dolutegravir, abacavir 3TC with atazanavir, tenofovir FTC. But what is really important and particular of this trial is that only women were included. This is very important because, yes, I'm happy. This is very important because, as you know, women are really have a low representation in clinical trials, so finally the result is difficult to extrapolate what you have in the trial to them. So moving to the results, as you can see, here in blue you have the dolutegravir-based arm. In terms of efficacy, it was better, so the authors concluded that there were superior efficacy with an overall lower toxicity, so welcome to this study performed in women. We move now, still on the antiretroviral topic, to studies of simplification or switch, and I will also talk to two very important studies. One is the striving study. We will see here the presentation of the week 48 results. There was a switch study to dolutegravir, abacavir 3TC from a variety of protease inhibitor, integrase inhibitor, or non-nucleoside-based regimens, and there were two arms. The first was switch immediately to this combination, and the other one was defer after the week 24. We were seeing here the last part of the study. This is the main result presented here of this study, and as you can see, there were a suppression rate of 92%, really well. But in fact, there were no virological data for 7% of cases, so it could be even better. So the authors concluded that this combination was well tolerated. They also had less adverse event than in the previous 24 weeks, what was not very clear for the authors either. There were no virological failures according to definition. So the conclusion was that the dolutegravir 3TC abacavir is a good alternative for simplification in patients coming from this variety of antiretroviral regimens. And the other study I would really like to mention very briefly is a small study coming from Spain in simplification to dolutegravir ripivirine, but the particular issue here is that they are heavily pretreated patients, suppressed patients, that have been on treatment for almost 20 years. But what is interesting is, if you can see here, the proportion of patients with resistant mutation was really high. At inclusion, they shouldn't have mutations for the integrase, but after 48 weeks, they stay all undetectable. So I think this is a very important study because it shows us that we can simplify not only patients under one regimen, but also patients who have been treated for long periods of time with complicated regimens. I will move now to what I call antiretroviral perspectives, and I would like to mention also two studies. One is the PADEL study from Argentina. This is a pilot study, a very small study too, with 20 patients, where we explore the combination of dolutegravir 3TC in naive patients, and we were presenting here the 48 weeks results. What you can see here in yellow is the viral load for each patient, and as you can see at week 48, there were 18 out of 20 patients who were undetectable on this combination. One was a serious adverse event, was a discontinuation of a patient who committed suicide, and the other was a virological failure, but eventually he resupprimmed thereafter without any changing in medication. So I think the conclusion of the author is that this study opened the window for investigation with this combination in naive patients, and then it can be cheaper, safer, because we are not including abacavir or tenofovir. And I think that the conclusion is that if we have a robust and high genetic barrier molecule, maybe adding only 3TC, it's enough, and we don't need the second nucleoside. And the other study of, I will call perspective, is the 48 weeks of the LATE study. This is a study to evaluate whether a combination of cabotegravir and rilpivirine injected in a long-acting nanosuspension could keep suppressed patients who were already undetectable after 20 weeks of oral antiretroviral therapy. As you know, cabotegravir is an integrase inhibitor and rilpivirine is a non-nucleoside. This is the design of the study. So the first 20 weeks, they were all treated with oral combination to get suppressed. They were receiving the last 4 weeks rilpivirine to test tolerance, and then they were randomized to 3 arms to receive every 4 weeks the intramuscular injections of cabotegravir and rilpivirine, every 8 weeks, or to continue with the same medication orally as a control arm. And we were saying here the result at 48 weeks. As you can see, suppression rates were very good and comparable for the 3 arms, but see more in detail, and according to the definition of virological non-response, there were 7% of patients with this virological non-response in the arm of patients receiving the injection every 8 weeks. I put here in red so you can see viral loads were really low. So we don't know what is the meaning of this. Probably it's dangerous with a drug such as rilpivirine with a very low genetic barrier. So the conclusions of the researchers of this study were the latter two, shown that this combination can keep the patient suppressed with injection every 4 or 8 weeks. There were 3 subjects who met the definition of virological failure, but only 1 developed resistance, unfortunately, to both families with mutations for cabotegravir and for rilpivirine. So the future for patients failing could be complicated in this trial. And then what I think is really interesting is the tolerability. Most of patients had mild side local effects, most of them, 80% I think, but all of them wanted to continue with the injection because they considered it was better to take the medication every day. I don't know whether it's going to be the scenario for all the patients, but certainly some of them will prefer the injections over the pills. So for phase 3 trials, they're going to continue with the every 4 weeks injections. And then the last point of the antiretroviral therapy I would like to mention is what I call antiretroviral therapy gaps. As you know, as you have seen, there's a lot of research going on with integrase inhibitors, are the recommended regimen for the American guidelines, for the European guidelines. We are trying to start all the patients with integrase inhibitor. There are also one integrase inhibitor as an alternative regimen in the last WHO consolidating guidance in 2016, but unfortunately, as you know, in clinical practice, they are not widely available in most of the countries of the South. So let's go to my content index. I will move now to the co-infection section, and I will talk a little bit about co-infection with hepatitis B, hepatitis C, and tuberculosis. I would like to present 2 clinical trials of co-infected patients with hepatitis C. The first one is the Astral-5, which is a trial exploring the efficacy and the tolerance of a combination of sofosbuvir and velpatasvir in HIV hepatitis C co-infected patients. This is a pan-genotypic combination that can work with genotype 1 to 5. And in this trial, there were 30% of cirrhotic patients on stable ART of very different nature. They were integrase inhibitor-based, protease inhibitor-based on non-nucleosides, because this combination has not significant drug interactions. The results were overall really good. 95% of sustained virological response at 12 weeks. And you can see here over the genotypes was more or less the same, with a lower response rate for 1B and 3, as happened in most of the DAA anti-hepatitis C trials in the modern times. The combination was safe, well tolerated, and as said, no drug-drug interaction, so very freely to administrate almost whatever you want as antiretroviral. And the other trial I would like to mention is the Turquoise 1 per 2. This is a little bit more complicated. It's a combination of onbitasvir, paritaprevir, boosted with ritonavir, with or without zasabuvir, and with or without ribavirin in patients with genotype only 1 or 4, because this combination only is active against genotype 1 and 4 of hepatitis C. Here you have the design. It's a little bit complicated. There were some arms of cirrhotic patients receiving a longer therapy. Genotype 4 did not receive in this arm zasabuvir. But again, as in the other study, results are really, really good, with over 96% of overall sustained virological response after 12 weeks. But we have to remember that with this regimen, we do have antiretroviral restrictions related to the need to boost this combination with ritonavir. Co-infection with hepatitis B. There have been a number of very interesting studies. In the interest of time, I will mention only 2. One that compare 3TC or 3TC tenofovir for hepatitis B prevention of mother-to-child transmission. That was taken from China. Very interesting study showing that both arms were efficacious to reduce enough the viral load to combine that with vaccination and probably avoid mother-to-child transmission for hepatitis B. So a very welcome study from China. Another interesting study showing that hepatocarcinoma is appearing in younger patients when they are co-infected with hepatitis B than in HIV negative patients. And then, sadly, I have to say that tuberculosis is always present. In every big conference of HIV, we're always talking about tuberculosis. So we need to improve diagnosis and therapy. There were a lot of sessions regarding new drugs, new administration, and a fantastic plenary presentation by Anton Pozniak. But I will mention only one trial, where it's called the RAFA trial. This is a trial that evaluated the effect of high dose of rifampicin, and it showed that we can reduce the mortality in severely immunosuppressed patients when we give higher dose of rifampin And as you can see, at 12 months, that was statistically significant. So other topics very quickly, because I have 1.5 minutes. So there were a lot of presentations on non-AIDS comorbidities. There were several studies on non-AIDS comorbidities and non-AIDS tumors in Africa. And this is, in fact, is good, because that is the reflect of the increased antiretroviral coverage in countries of the South, and the confirmation of the increasing comorbidity and accelerated aging in European studies. This is a problem we will see, and we have to accept it. And then other session, or the very interesting session, there was a fantastic session of optimizing laboratory diagnosis and monitoring. All tests of point of care tests for the diagnosis of monitoring of HIV, tuberculosis, and other opportunistic infections. This is really a need, because we really need to diagnose patients in the place where they are. And then an heterogeneity of very interesting studies of resistance to antiretrovirals that I won't have the time to discuss. So, in 30 seconds, take-home messages. Adolescents are becoming a key population, so special programs are needed. There are strong differences in the initial therapy from north to south, particularly regarding to integrase inhibitors. Dual therapies are becoming an interesting line to explore, even in experienced patients, also for the long-lasting injecting drugs. Maybe not for all patients, but it will be very interesting in the future. And hepatitis C, HIV do not seem longer a different population, because we are curing all the patients as is happening for hepatitis C inborn infected. Tuberculosis is always there, and we need to improve diagnosis and treatment. Non-AIDS condition and aging is an increasing problem in the north and emerging problem in the south. So to conclude, we have to continue working to translate all this fantastic clinical science into action for everyone. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Juan. And my apologies to our rapporteurs. We've given them a tough task here to present in 12 minutes, and our clock here is ticking down from 15, so apologies if that has created difficulties at all. I have the pleasure next of introducing our Track C lead rapporteur, Patrick Sullivan. Patrick is a professor of epidemiology at Emory University's Rollins School of Public Health, the co-director of the Prevention Sciences Core at Emory's Center for AIDS Research, and a member of the U.S. Presidential Advisory Council on HIV/AIDS. Dr. Sullivan's career has included work on HIV surveillance at the U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, HIV vaccine research at NIH-supported HIV Vaccine Trials Network, and research on HIV prevention for MSM supported by the US NIH. Please welcome Patrick.
Good afternoon, and thanks for this opportunity to summarize Track C on behalf of my rapporteur team, who I will introduce at the end. It's critical to say that just as we demand and expect and strive for full coverage of early and universal treatment for people living with HIV, that we also should reject HIV prevention programs which are not at scale, which are not fully effective, and which are not culturally competent for the people they need to serve. Access to prevention services and harm reduction is also both a rights and health equity issue. But I'm going to focus primarily on primary prevention. In terms of PrEP, there was a lot of news from the conference. As far as oral Truvada goes, there was a report of the open-label extension of the IPERGAY study, in which the effectiveness, once men knew what they were taking, was 97% versus 86% in the original trial. And adherence was actually higher in the RCT. When men know what they're taking, they're motivated to take it and to adhere. In the Partners Demonstration Project, which actually combined PrEP as a bridging period while the HIV-positive partner in a serodiscordant partnership was getting on to PrEP, they observed a 95% reduction in HIV incidence versus the expected, and none of the people who acquired HIV from their partner were on PrEP at that time. We also heard about how we deliver PrEP. HPTN 073 was a really tailored demonstration project of PrEP for African American and other Black MSM in 3 U.S. cities. PrEP uptake was early. When men were offered PrEP, they decided to go on early. Self-reported and laboratory-based adherence was high, and adherence was harder for men who had polysubstance abuse, but adherence was actually higher in men who had primary partners. In Thailand, models for PrEP implementation both paid through a self-pay program or free through the Princess Prep program supported by a foundation, have enrolled over 700 MSM in PrEP. And in the US, there's been over a 700% increase in PrEP uptake in the last several years. However, it was noted that there are some gaps between the states that are struggling most with new HIV diagnoses and infections, but also have lower levels of PrEP uptake. In terms of non-oral PrEP, an analysis of MTN 020 data that used residual drug levels in vaginal rings allowed a look at how adherence related to protection in that study. And women who had low, moderate, or high adherence had estimated protection of 56 or 65% respectively. In the long and short of it, Bob Grant emphasized the critical sort of programmatic issue of good protocols for acute infection testings to avoid prescribing PrEP for men who might be in a seroconversion period. And Ian McGowan reported on early stage work of rilpivirine in which a single dose of rilpivirine resulted in detectable levels of the drug in 100% of 7 subjects a year and a half after that injection, so very long-acting agents. Slim Karim described the idea that there's a niche opportunity for topical PrEP and that if not everyone needs to want to use it for it to be valuable. And a study of preferences among women showed that duration of protection, ease of use, and the ability to be discreet with topical PrEP were important factors for them. In terms of the cost and benefits, there's, I think, always a need to be vigilant about transmission of acquisition of resistant HIV in the setting of PrEP. But Bob Grant demonstrated that there are about 8 HIV infections averted for every 1 acquired with resistance, and that acquisition of drug-resistant virus is rare. In terms of STIs, there was an increase in STIs among men in the open label of extension of the IPERGAY study. And there was also a lot of discussion that made clear that we can't allow STI rates among men on PrEP to denigrate the prevention value of PrEP. Connie Kellum suggested that PrEP also offers opportunities for increased HIV testing and care engagement. And this discussion led to one of my favorite quotes of the conference from Dr. Nelly Mugo, who said, "STIs may be more of an opportunity than a complication of PrEP." It's also great to see agents in the pipeline, Maraviroc in a phase 2 trial of the safety and tolerability of that agent for use in women. In terms of prevention for women, the central role of young people has already been highlighted by previous speakers, but an analysis of the epidemic in KwaZulu-Natal illustrated that young women are particularly important from the perspective of prevention, acquiring HIV at a rate of nearly 3 times that of other subgroups, and initiating ART less promptly and at lower levels. Age-disparate relationships, although their role as drivers of the epidemic is, I think, still a matter of discussion, were reported to have a higher frequency of condomless sex and more alcohol use before sex. It speaks to this idea that information about risks in specific contexts can be used to provide more targeted and specific intervention efforts. In terms of intervention, a conditional cash transfer program for high school girls in South Africa reported no impact of cash transfer on depression or hope for the future, although this was in the context of high school attendance among the control group. The INSPIRE trial was a small study in Baltimore and a pre-post design of trauma-informed intervention for drug-involved female sex workers resulted in increased safety behaviors and lower levels of sexual risks for HIV acquisition or transmission. It was pointed out in a session on safer contraception that there's still a need for clear, unambiguous, and evidence-based guidance that reflects and supports women's reproductive health choices and recognizes a difference in their needs at different times of their lives, particularly for women living with HIV. It's also noted that few safer conception studies have reported pregnancy as an outcome, which is a highly relevant outcome to the participants. This has been a great and important moment for trans health with the release of 3 special issues around the conference and a great summary by Tonya Poteet of the landscape of our global knowledge about the health of trans people and HIV prevention. Tonya, I reproduced very few data, but I reproduced this one, which is the increase in the studies of trans people that have increased in the last couple years and increased somewhat in geographic range. We had a description of an intervention study for trans women in multiple U.S. cities that was a 6-session small group intervention over 3 weeks. and showed reductions in risk behavior for the women who received that intervention. We need to be thinking about implementation, and in a pre-conference section, the transit or implementation for comprehensive HIV and STI programs for transgender people was discussed, and emphasized the need for specific programs and not merely adaptation of existing programs. There are still gaps, to be sure. We need more data from outside the US. 90% of the studies to date have been solely observational, only 6% prospective, and only 1 intervention trial. So we need to move towards those prospective and intervention trials and also focus on concerns other than mental and reproductive health, including non-communicable diseases. However, it's important to say that we have enough evidence to act now. In terms of prevention for adolescents, data emerged about some of the risks for adolescents, including a high prevalence of forced sex for young people in South Africa, where the prevalence of forced sex among high school students was 13% among both young men and women. And in fact, the prevalence of forced sex was very close to even in those two groups. Forced sex was twice as common among high school students in urban compared to rural schools. In a population-based survey in the US, when comparing gay and bi-identified young high school men to straight-identified men, both groups had roughly comparable levels of sexual risk behavior, but the young gay and bi-identified men had a 10 times greater reported use of injection drug use. So this illustrates the syndemics of health problems in young gay men and the need for multifaceted interventions. In terms of ways to access adolescents, the one-to-one program in Kenya used multiple social media ways to reach young people through mobile phones. The most common issues that came up in conversations with prevention workers were around interpersonal relationship issues, as well as HIV and STI. For young women, concerns about pregnancy and contraception were also prominent. The Desmond Tutu HIV Foundation took it mobile with the Tutu Teen Truck, including mobile testing, where they found a 3% prevalence of new HIV diagnoses, and nearly half of the young people who tested were testing for the first time. How did they attract adolescents? Those of us who have them know that it's with internet access, loud music, and giveaway contests, meeting people where they are and finding things that would pull young people in. In a self-testing program for adolescents found self-tests to be very usable overall, 4 out of 5 stars on usability, 4.2 stars out of 5 on acceptability, and 20% debut testers. ATN 110-113 was a PrEP trial in adolescents illustrating that PrEP was safe and well tolerated. However, there was a high incidence of HIV infection, high rates of discontinuation, and challenges with adherence, especially when monitoring went from monthly visits to quarterly visits. Bone mass declined slightly initially, but this was felt to be reversible. In terms of HIV self-testing, we had multiple reports of self-testing for MSM. A survey of MSM in China found that HIV self-testing was highly acceptable among MSM. In this survey of app and internet users, a quarter had self-tested, and of those who had tested, a third of them had their first test, their debut test, with a self-test. In a randomized study of at-home testing versus solely clinic-based testing in Australia, the outcome was the rate of testing, and those MSM who were provided self-tests had twice the rate of testing compared to those who had to come in for clinic-based testing. There was no change in STI testing, but a selective increase in HIV testing. A self-test kit distribution program for MSM in Brazil resulted in over 4,000 requests. Kit delivery was better when those kits were mailed out to users. Among the users who said they wanted to pick them up in pharmacies, there was a lower rate of delivering them. One of the limitations is that only 17% of the people who got kits returned results to the program. However, among those, 95% were confident that the test results were right, and 98% would recommend self-testing to a friend. A study in Zambia identified barriers in terms of self-testing for the instructions that are given to clients, and that resulted in the development of a standard script used by counselors to increase usability. In Malawi and Zimbabwe, when test kits were distributed through CBOs and peer educators, there was differentially high uptake by adolescents and men, and most preferred to test in private. In terms of other prevention opportunities, Lyle discussed HVTN 100, which is a go for a clade C specific multi-component vaccine strategy in South Africa. And there was a robust discussion of the use of apps in prevention and care. The app owners for gay dating apps were very willing and present to engage. Hornet is already providing reminders for routine HIV testing. Grindr partnering with local organizations for prevention messaging. Blued referring men to physical testing locations in China, and the description of the My Choices app in development to increase HIV testing among young MSM in the US. We would like to call for transition from PrEP science to PrEP programs at scale, for renewed honesty in our discussions of why people are at risk for HIV and how we serve them best. We need to invest in the science to address stigma. This is an amazing time for trans health, but we must keep the momentum on making trans health programs real and move from describing problems into solving them and bringing that to scale. We need to use early implementation studies, and I would just say it's incumbent on all of us who are doing these studies to ask up front what the implementers and the governments who we want to own these programs at scale are going to need to make the case, to dedicate the resources, and to conduct them properly, and ask those questions as early as possible. And we need to bring programs, including PrEP programs, to scale in all contexts. We're not monolithic communities of young people or gay people or trans people or sex workers, but there's nuance to our communities that must be respected to get the most out of these programs. I have to humbly thank a very robust team of enthusiastic colleagues represented here, as well as the IAS. And I'll end. This is at the beginning, before we were sleep deprived, but it's been our honor to report on the conference and to share this with you this morning. Thank you.
I have the pleasure to next introduce our Track D lead rapporteur, Oliade Akani. Oliade is the Executive Director of Journalists Against AIDS Nigeria, a leading media-based non-governmental organization which seeks to contribute to the prevention, care, and control of HIV/AIDS, tuberculosis, and reproductive health issues in Nigeria. Over the past 10 years, Oliade has served in various capacities in JA/AIDS and in several other advocacy-based coalitions in promoting HIV/AIDS and TB treatment literacy, capacity building for media and civil society groups, and policy monitoring on universal access to prevention, treatment, and care services. Please welcome her.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I want to say thank you to the IAS team for the opportunity, and I also want to say a big thank you to my team members comprising of Aditi Sharma, Julie Bellin, Donald Tobaiwa, Manju Chatani, Michaela Rahimi, and Lynette Mabote, who worked tirelessly throughout this conference to cover the sessions, the insights, and the discussions that you have provided. So what did you tell us in the course of this conference? You told us that inclusion and equity for all is essential. You told us that since Durban 2000, we have made remarkable progress against HIV, but we must not allow science to leave communities behind. We need prevention and treatment, equity for all, for lesbians, for gays, bisexuals, transgender, intersex, sex workers, people who use drugs, people with disabilities, indigenous people, migrants, prisoners, young people, adolescents, women, boys, men, the elderly, and all people living with HIV. We at this conference are extremely concerned about the closing of civil society spaces in all our contexts. And we heard very clearly, even from the opening ceremony, about the urgent plea to ensure that the Treatment Action Campaign continues to do the great work they've started. We also heard that HIV is not a crime. And one of the most exciting highlights has been the emergence of a movement united against criminalization of specific populations, including people living with HIV, lesbian, gay, bisexuals, transgender, sex workers, and people who use drugs. There was a call to analyze criminalization using an intersectional feminist frame, as female and transgender sex workers, migrants, indigenous, and Black women suffer most from HIV-specific laws in many countries. Criminalization survivors and activists took their key messages to the first plenary chanting, HIV is not a crime. Laws and policies that criminalize and penalize the most disenfranchised will continue to fuel the inequities that drive vulnerability and poor access. So, stigma has been a much talked about word in this conference. What will it take to put stigma reduction on the center stage? The time is long past to move the issue of stigma from obligatory sentences in all presentations to a prominent plenary and pre-conference. Despite widespread acknowledgement of stigma as a foremost barrier preventing people living with HIV and key populations accessing and using healthcare services, there's far too little focus and investment on stigma reduction interventions, which are within our national plans and programs. Dealing with stigma in our health facilities is an urgent priority. Reducing stigma in all of its ugly forms has to be the center of all our interventions. So, is Durban 2016 about gender equality? Yes, it is. The progress achieved in the HIV response could be lost if underlying issues of gender equality is left unaddressed. Gender transformative goals be essential in the designing of interventions that address power imbalances that put people in their diversity at risk. To achieve gender equality, innovation is critical. We cannot afford to continue doing what we have always done. Structural barriers such as gender norms, the socialization of young girls, and power imbalances between men and women, continue to put adolescent girls and young women at the risk of infection. These need to be unraveled and challenged through comprehensive sexuality education, addressing gender equality in a holistic manner, catalyzing other relevant sectors, addressing the intersections between HIV and gender-based violence, ending child marriage, keeping girls in school, as well as ensuring that men and boys are also educated and involved to support these initiatives. Don't shortchange human rights. We've heard that over and over in this conference. Our ambitions are plentiful, but our pockets are empty. We need money to deliver on all our commitments. Each and every one of our governments in the North and the South must take shared responsibility and act in global solidarity. Too often, community-led and human rights approaches are the first to take the cut in the current context of trying to do more with less. This is not doing the right thing. Our immediate litmus test will include whether we fully fund the Global Fund and stand up to exploitative patent laws. We've also heard in this conference that there are no silver bullets. Complex contexts require intersectional approaches. Just as Wiseka Dubula said, it's not just about scientists or politicians, it's about people. Let's go back to our communities. We know what works and what doesn't work. There has been a rallying call for an analysis of the complexities and intersectionality of people's lives and context that requires responses that are as layered. The interconnected nature of race, class, and gender create overlapping and independent systems of discrimination or disadvantage. To address HIV risk or improve access within this context require a combination of biomedical, social, behavioral, and structural interventions that themselves are broad and multi-sectoral. Thank you very much.
That was great work. Thank you. Next, I have the privilege to introduce our Track E lead rapporteur, Bernard Gardiner. Bernard's involvement in the HIV response started over 30 years ago as a volunteer in Australia. After 5 years working in East and Southeast Asia, Bernard spent 7 years as the Global HIV Program Manager of the International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies based in Geneva. That program was the UNAIDS Collaborating Center for Stigma Reduction in partnership with GNP+. He is currently undertaking a PhD within the Living Positive in Queensland study at the School of Public Health, University of Queensland, in partnership with Queensland Positive People and the Queensland AIDS Council. This qualitative, longitudinal research is giving voice to the lived experience of long-term survivors as they age in rural areas. Please welcome Bernard.
Okay, Track E covers implementation research, economics, and synergies with other health and development sectors. My team included Lynette Lowndes, the former Deputy Director of the International HIV/AIDS Alliance, Dr. Corinne Dubé from the University of North Carolina, Felicity Hiquam, who's the Deputy Director of ERASA, and Mike Strauss from the Health Economics and HIV/AIDS and AIDS Research Division here in Durban. Implementation research, a really good definition was offered here. Multidisciplinary specialty that seeks generalisable knowledge about behaviour of stakeholders, organisations, communities and individuals in order to understand the scale of reasons for and strategies to close the gap between evidence and the routine practice for health in the real-world contexts. An abundance of results of implementation research were presented, but given the level of detail, it's not possible to present and quote many of the great examples that are now available for you in the session summaries that my team produced as a resource online. So I'll focus on quality improvement and run chart tools that came up often that are useful for helping us with this precision balancing of quality and quantity. A simple model for quality improvement was presented by Raymond Morse based on the questions, what are we trying to accomplish? How will we know that a change is an improvement? And what change can we make that will result in an improvement? QI methods can be used alongside economic methods, like cost effectiveness and efficiency analysis, to address both quality and sustainability concerns. Collaboration between economists and programmers, however, is essential to test assumptions in this process and ensure necessary elements are in unit costings. For example, community preparedness for PrEP or like option B. There was a skill development workshop for use of run charts for program managers. Gives them a tool for increasing the adaptability of real-world decision-making and a basis for assessing the impact of changes to implementation strategies. You can see here that practice changes are plotted over time against a performance indicator and a target so that progress can be assessed. As Dr. Nitya Panyupak pointed out, technical guidance tends to descend from above and needs to be adapted to real-world realities, and she challenges to then surpass those guidelines. However, these implementation tools for sex workers, gay men and other men who have sex with men, and trans people, respectively, set a new standard by drawing together the evidence and then testing this against community values. and preferences to produce guidelines approved formally by WHO, but also developed and approved by communities. These tools put community empowerment at the centre, a first for WHO to include community empowerment in the science, and also to acknowledge the impact of violence on key populations. Turning to the economics, we're used to economists producing cost-effectiveness analysis data like this to guide resource allocation, and in this case show clearly the linear relationship between drug and testing costs and coverage. Thus, the call for 90-90-90 to be $90 to treat HIV, $90 to treat TB, and $90 to treat Hep C at this conference. But economists are increasingly contributing to the policy space by taking up the challenge of testing new ideas that are put forward, like 2 for 1, by exploring what would need to change to make these ideas possible. The push is on for a front-loading of investment in the present 4 to 5 year-old window period of opportunity, and economists are helping to make the case. For example, the Heard work on fast-track case for Namibia was presented, showing excellent long-term benefits from front-loading the investment. However, as a movement, we already know from past examples, like TB and harm reduction, that even the best evidence can count for little without political will. While the response needs to be fully funded, there is little doubt that we could have less HIV for the money we already have. The key to correcting this is spending the funds in the right place, with the right people in the right way. Unless we are determined, the 10% not reached in 90-90-90 will be the 10% that most need to be reached for impact. Sustainability depends on the incidence of new infections decreasing in the key populations. Taking economies to the local level, community savings schemes developed organically by sex workers hold promise as structural intervention to reduce HIV risk among sex workers, and as seen in the oral poster presentation, when you don't have money, he controls you. Now, synergies with other health and development sectors. The education sector could do more to facilitate universal access to sex education, condoms, and sanitary pads in schools. Students should be an easy-to-reach, it's captive audience, really. But if gatekeepers make them hard to reach, this creates a battle we should not have to put resources into, such as in my own country, where there have been attacks on the Safe Schools program. We heard often that implementation is being roadblocked by unjust criminalisation of transmission of gay men, of sex workers and drug users. Such laws were described by Edwin Cameron as vicious, misguided and evil. Getting rid of these laws is probably the largest efficiency gain that we possibly have, rivaling efficiencies like dropping prices of treatment and testing. Countries that take multilateral funding while maintaining criminalisation are in effect taking funds under false pretences and wasting them. As countries are pushed towards reliance on domestic funding, the evidence is clear that they are not usually funding civil society. So international donors need to find ways to get funds to community-level organisations so that work in hostile environments to bring about social and legal changes and provide access to services can continue. In all conscience, it cannot go on that community groups risking violence and arrest do this work unpaid. As Bisi Alimi said, we need to invest in the stomachs, the bodies and the mentalities of the people on the front line. Enough of peanuts. Alex Coutinho of Partners in Health advocated developing systems of health, not health systems, which leave out activists and the intersection with the world beyond the clinic door. He identified a number of risks to be managed, including non-communicable diseases for long-term survivors as they age. As Debbie Prasad said, lifelong treatment is not an easy task. Formally extending the cascade beyond viral suppression would include quality of life issues for long-term survivors. 1/3 of deaths of people living with HIV are from TB. These twin epidemics need to be dealt with together. At this stage, this late stage, we still need to break down the silos. Impactful service integration will require a focus on human resources for health, including training and capacity building. I see those red umbrellas appearing between the silos, leading the way. Finally, it's wise to reflect on who's not in the room, and if we need to address that. Migration, trade, conflict zones, security issues, disasters, etc. were all mentioned, but to be honest, we're struggling to make progress with the obvious synergies that I've already covered above. However, the symbolism of the representative of people with disabilities not being able to access the stage with other representatives of civil society in the opening ceremony speaks for itself. Technology can overcome some barriers. This is Kerry Thomas, who participated in the criminalisation pre-conference via phone from prison in the USA, where he's serving 30 years because he could not prove he had disclosed his HIV status to his partner. 30 years. This is despite having an undetectable viral load and having always used condoms. A grave injustice. However, he's an activist from behind bars, and he made it here with the help of technology. To close, I want to acknowledge the synergies with the arts sector, which adds so much know-how, insight and beauty to our collective efforts, including designing engaging protest action. Thank you.
Thank you, Bernard. Great work. I have the privilege next of introducing our Community and Leadership Lead Rapporteur, Chris Maloris. Chris is an activist and a passionate advocate for the meaningful engagement of people living with HIV and other key populations in the response to AIDS, and for rights-based and gender-responsive laws, policies, and programs that meet the needs of communities, delivered by communities, for communities. Chris is living with HIV since 2000. He changed his career soon after his HIV-positive diagnosis, leaving the world of academia and astrophysics to be part of the global response to AIDS, and has worked within civil society and the United Nations. He has worked as the director of programs at the Global Network of People Living with HIV and is currently working at UNAIDS as a community mobilization advisor. Please welcome Chris.
Good afternoon, everyone. I know it's been a hard few days, so I'll try to be short. Thank you to IAS for allowing me to be the rapporteur for the Community and Leadership program. I'd like to thank my team, Gennady, Martha, Matan, Morenike, Venita. Thank you very much for all your hard work and dedication. So, it's not easy to deliver a report for community and leadership. Communities in the program were key populations, most at-risk populations, vulnerable populations, geographically focused or identity-based populations, basically all populations that any program or policy targets. So, pretty much the whole program. And there was no specific track. This was in community engagement priorities, responses, and engagement were discussed in almost every session. So as you can imagine, it's difficult to do a report back in 12 minutes. So what I will present is just a very simple glimpse of some of the themes that are coming from communities. So many of the sessions we attended reflected on the great progress that has been made since Durban 2000 and the daunting, overwhelming task that lays ahead of us if we are to end the AIDS epidemic by 2030. This conference, for many of us, has been a conference of reflection and soul-searching, looking back at what was and examine how to move ahead. While celebrating the success in the last 16 years, the general feeling is that we are at a pivotal point of the response. We know what the problem is, we know what needs to change for each community, but we do not quite know how to get there fast enough with the tools that we have. For people living with HIV, there seems to be agreement on the treatment goals, as ambitious as they may be. But we need to also think about treatment goals that capture the quality and the stigma-free services that we need to have. And the 17 million on treatment is a great success, as is the amazing scale-up of the global plan to eliminate new pediatric infections among children. A new generation free from HIV is possible, but people are dying. 1.1 million people living with HIV died last year. Because of inequities in access are widening, but unlike in 2000, people are dying quietly. Because of inequities in access are widening, people who are not reached are those we see less and those who governments care less about. The first step to treatment is testing, and the barriers to testing are poverty, social inequities, and discrimination because of sexual orientation and gender identity, sex work, drug use, migrant status, imprisonment. The discussions around key populations, for lack of a better term, and that was debated throughout the conference, unfortunately does not seem to have changed much. Men who have sex with men, people who use drugs, sex workers, and transgender people continue to face discrimination, marginalization, exclusion, violence, and are denied services. Many raise the question whether these key populations are becoming the 10-10-10. We know the issue, we know what needs to change, but as many pointed out, there is great disconnect between the discourse in AIDS conferences and the reality when we go back home. And we have implementation tools. Bernard just presented them. The sex worker implementation tool, the MSM implementation tool, the transit, and very soon the drug users implementation tool. We're reminded conference after conference that staggering magnitude of incidence rates and AIDS-related deaths among women, girls, and adolescents, particularly in this region, in Eastern Southern Africa. In Sub-Saharan Africa, adolescent girls between the ages of 10 and 19 years account for 75% of new HIV infections among adolescents. Harmful gender norms and inequities, including child marriage, obstacles to education, and sexual and reproductive health services, poverty, food insecurity, and violence drive this increased vulnerability. HIV now is the leading cause of death among adolescents in Africa and the second globally. There were some discussions around how to involve men and boys, both for their health, but as well as their key role in reducing vulnerability among women. But it was clear that there is no solution. We are presented with the same issue again and again in every conference. PrEP was one of the new prevention technologies that was mentioned, and we're now starting to look at implementation. One of the questions that people raised was, okay, if you take adolescent girls, if it's so difficult for adolescent girls to even access the basic reproductive health services, how can we provide PrEP? The point was that the option needs to be made available. The barriers is for us to overcome. But there is caution not to over-medicalize the response, especially for key populations. Another improvement, it's becoming easier and easier to talk about community responses to HIV. It's easier to see the partnerships and see them in sessions between governments and civil society working together to deliver services. Systems for health was mentioned several times. the integration of community and health systems into resilient, people-centered systems for health. But please, no more demonstration models to prove that community responses work. We moved beyond that. We need sessions that describe how a scale-up can work. We need sessions that describe how integration of community responses in people-centered systems for health works at scale. Funding. Everyone talked about funding, that we seem to be flatlining. And people suggested a way to go to 2030 using what we have, using effectiveness and efficiency, intensifying primary prevention and tackling stigma and discrimination. And throughout of those, community response role was highlighted as key. So community responses seem to be called to the rescue, but where is the funding for communities? For communities to deliver what is asked for, we need innovative funding mechanisms that allow funding to flow from governments to communities. We need international funding that has no restrictions, particularly for sex workers and people who use drugs. We need funding that is accessible by grassroots organizations. These are the organizations left behind. And we need that an engagement of civil society that is resourced and works, and that work is remunerated. Volunteerism is not sustainable. We need a fully funded global fund. We need a fully funded AIDS response. Lastly, for me, this was what made this conference different. There were several sessions the last few days by community leaders on the future of activism in the response to AIDS. The discussions reflected on what motivated activism at the beginning of the pandemic, was sustained through Durban and beyond. Activists questioned their raison d'etre, need for self-accountability, their own legitimacy in a time of shrinking political space for civil society. These were truly emotional and inspiring discussions. Community engagement has evolved and professionalized. Since Durban 2000, we now have CCMs with civil society as members. We have civil society Global Fund principal recipients. We have NGOs sitting on the boards of the Global Fund and UNAIDS. We have the Robert Carr Networks Fund. We have networks of sex work projects, transgender networks, international networks of people who use drugs. The Global Forum on MSM and HIV turned 10 years old at this conference. Charlize Theron put it very clearly when she said that HIV isn't just transmitted by sex. It's transmitted by sexism, by racism, poverty, and homophobia. She reminded us how AIDS thrives in inequities. Tuesday morning's plenary was, at least for me, a chilling reminder of how criminalization of HIV exposure and transmission is having a tremendous impact around the globe. It's not just in the United States and in the global north. And in the days of AIDS denialism, this poster, Silence Equals Death, helped shape the activism that changed the fates of the AIDS response. And today this message resonates equally, if not louder. AIDS is not over. And that, for me, was the biggest message of this conference. This was a conference that reminded us we need to celebrate success, but we need to learn how we got there, and that our work is far from being completed. Yes, the way ahead is daunting, but we're not giving up. It is time to break the silence again and renew hope and commitment. When speaking about AIDS activism, Mark Haywood said that we are not anti-government, we're not pro-government, we are pro-people. Activism needs to use anger to change the unchangeable, and we have to use love and solidarity. Solidarity with each other and solidarity with other social movements. Activism, at least for me, was very much alive in AIDS 2016, Durban. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. Next, I'd like to introduce our Global Village and Youth Lead Rapporteur, Renata Langley. Renata is from the island of Dominica, but currently lives in Barbados, where she just completed her first degree in political science, gender, and developmental studies at the University of the West Indies. She's an active member of ICW Barbados and a member of Life Goes On Dominica, an NGO helping families both infected and affected who are coping with HIV/AIDS. She enjoys meeting new people and hopes to learn from others with experience in the field of HIV/AIDS in order to bring the challenges of women living with HIV/AIDS to the forefront. Please welcome Renata.
Good evening, everybody. Good afternoon. I would first like to say a big thank you to the International AIDS Society for giving me the opportunity to be here today. And I also would like to give a great thank you to all my group members, Chikabu Alagbauso, Primrose Manialo, Charles Pensulo, Riwan Yusuf, and Janet Bilal. It was a very exciting journey for me to be repertoire in the Global Village this past week. In our session on Monday, we heard that young leaders are speaking, both in educating their peers, and when they do get access to decision-making spaces, they do speak there as well. However, they are being marginalized, isolated, and excluded from decision-making forums, which negatively is impacting the progress of elimination of HIV and AIDS. One way of getting the world to listen is through creative arts. Film and dance is beginning to make an impression on our young people of today. Showcasing and celebrating useful, successful women projects around the globe were one of the activities shown in the Global Village. They showed pictures, and the pictures gave life to untold stories of women living in remote places, living with HIV and AIDS. The use of creative arts in the fight against HIV was showcased by a film produced in Malawi by the Art and Global Health Center. This enabled them to tell the stories in the way they wanted, resulting in a sharp increase in the number of men demanding HIV-related services in their communities. PLWHAs was saying that it was time for they to tell their own stories instead of people telling stories about them. In Tuesday's session, the unspoken pleasure in sexual health and rights highlighted the taboo that was associated with sexual pleasure in relation to reproductive health and rights. Panelists and audience agreed that criminalization and lack of comprehensive sexual education, coupled with the silence associated with sex, is negatively affecting the LGBTQ community, sex workers, and youth. Mala Tabo from Cameroon, sex education, said that sex education should go beyond talking about how to avoid having contracting HIV, sorry. Whether you are from liberal Holland or conservative Pakistan, talking about sexual pleasure is taboo. This particularly disadvantaged the LGBT community and youth who needed information and education, not to silence and shame them. Other key populations that were brought to the forefront were those of the adolescents. In Nigeria, Doberty Charles has created and campaigned for a capacity building program to help reduce youth violence and transform them into agents of change. On Wednesday, Brian Walsh from the LiquidNet Foundation detailed challenges with current funding mechanisms. He stated that there's a disconnection between donors, non-profit organizations, and funders. Non-profit support organizations were making changes in the lives of many by providing a safe place for the assembling of people living with HIV. In Uganda, Mama's Club was a great example of that non-profit organization. They changed the lives of many mothers, giving them the opportunity to live healthy, long lives to be able to take care of their children. In South Africa, the global network of people living with HIV and AIDS focused on how to improve the dignity and quality of life of its members. We are now seeing that pre-exposure prophylactics and the vaginal ring were new prevention methods that would help to decrease the spread of HIV and AIDS. Educating the general public on PEP has opened new avenues for the support of women living with HIV. Men are now showing initiative and willing to support women who take the drugs. The research of finding the HIV vaccine is still ongoing. The 2009 RV144 trial demonstrated that those who received the vaccine were 31% less likely to get infected. On Thursday, there was a very engaging dance performance in the morning on the main stage at the Global Village. The presenter had the audience involved. It was an exciting new way to see how people of different backgrounds could unite and dance together without allowing the difference of race, religion, and culture to be an obstruction. In strengthening the psychosocial support for adolescents in Lesotho, the community-based organization Sentibal is providing life skills and psychological community-based psychological support, that aim at helping young people between the ages of 10 and 19. There was also a documentary shown which portrayed a university in China, and there was a question and answer session with the students. They were asked what were their reactions to, or if they knew of anybody living with HIV and AIDS. While some stated that they would never discriminate against someone who was positive, others had different views. There is much to teach Chinese students on HIV and AIDS. Other challenges faced by the PLHA community are those of criminalization laws. At the ICW session, we looked at criminalization laws in Canada that are charging women for non-disclosure. Currently, there is one woman in Zimbabwe who is facing charges for non-disclosure to her partner for an affair or a sexual relation they had 4 years ago. So, to sum it up, we can say that there is still a lot of work to be done, and we need to try to involve youth in the fight against HIV and AIDS. Thank you.
Thank you, Renata. You had one of the hardest jobs here. The Global Village is an immensely dynamic space. We're really grateful for you and your partners who were able to summarize that for us. I don't even know how you started to do that, so thank you. We have just 2 final announcements before we transition over to the closing session, and I will pull up an exciting announcement here, because I realize I have not done that throughout. Did I do it right? Great. So the Creative and Novel Ideas and Research Program is a partnership between the National Institutes of Health in the United States, the NIH-funded Centers for AIDS Research, and the International AIDS Society. The program supports innovative research projects to introduce scientists from other disciplines to the field of HIV research. The intent of this program is to attract both international and US-based early-stage investigators from outside the field of HIV research to help address key scientific questions in HIV. We're proud to announce this year's 10 awardees, who will each receive $150,000 to fund their research. The awardees and their funded research projects are Amy Barczak from Massachusetts General Hospital, Harvard Medical School, Sue Crawford, Baylor College of Medicine, Burl Gooden, University of Alabama at Birmingham, Lindsay James, University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, Mario Masis, Johns Hopkins University, Siavash Mir Arabaigi, University of California, San Diego, Robert Owens, University of California, San Diego, Holly Ramaj, University of Pennsylvania, Arisa Mwaka Sabakaki, Makerere University College of Health Sciences, and Aaron Thrift, Baylor College of Medicine. Let's give them a round of applause for their award. Finally, you may not have seen them roaming around the halls, but we have had a group of independent evaluators who have been assessing the impact of AIDS 2016 against the objectives that the conference coordinating committee set out at the beginning of this process 2 years ago. They are conducting an evaluation and would actively like your feedback. Shortly, all of our delegates will receive an email with that online evaluation. We strongly encourage you to take that evaluation. We actively adapt each year's conference in order to respond to your feedback. I think many people here at AIDS 2016 see the changes from AIDS 2014, and we would like to further perfect that for AIDS 2018. So we will transition the floor now. Please stick around. We're starting immediately with our closing session. Thank you.
Did you pick up the microphone? Yeah? She was here? Do you know where she is?
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the stage performing artist Male to perform her song Chimsoro.
Okay, good afternoon. I'm here to talk about sex work. As sex workers and sex worker organizations, this is the 21st International AIDS Conference. It is an honor to address you all, but sadly based on the laws of this country, in many other countries, sex work is still criminalized. The criminalization of sex work has a negative impact on sex workers' health and human rights. At this conference, we as sex workers were visible and spoke for ourselves. Sex workers presented and shared their experiences of working under different models. And what was evident is that criminalization does not work. So, if you missed it, the research is out there and it is overwhelming. So with the time I have, I would like to tell you what you can over the next 2 years. Until we meet again at the next conference, we are allies. We have a common cause. Sex workers are your front line in the battle against HIV. We all want access. We all want equity. And we all want it now. As sex workers, we ask everyone at this conference to join Amnesty International, the UN Family, USAID, Human Rights Watch, and so many others to commit to a human rights agenda and to advocate for the decriminalization of sex work and other key populations globally. At the next conference, a lot of our comrades will not be there. because criminalization would have killed them. That is why we need you to go back to your communities, your organizations, your countries, and fight for the rights and support sex workers in the struggle for decriminalization. You have the power to make sure that if we make it to the Netherlands in 2018, we are not criminals. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the stage performing artist Male to perform her song Chimsoro.
Good afternoon, thank you. My name is Male, and this next song is called Chimsoro. We celebrate unconditional love today, so I do hope you enjoy. Thank you so much. God bless you all for the beautiful work that you do. It's been an honor and a privilege. My name is Male. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the stage the AIDS 2016 Conference Co-Chairs, Professors Olive Shisana and Chris Bayer.
It's with great pleasure that Olive and I recognize the artists who designed the AIDS 2016 logo that you've been seeing everywhere at the conference. Yeah. Every 2 years, we put out an open call to young designers everywhere to submit a visual identity for the International AIDS Conference, and we'll do the same for 2018. It's a tradition that has consistently generated truly inspirational design and captured the essence of each conference.
Our colleagues spoke of the designer of the AIDS 2016 logo to understand his creative process of what inspired him. Let me read his words, if I may. I knew I wanted to design something that reflected the arts and culture of the host country, South Africa. As I researched the country's art history, I was struck by partnered baskets woven by South African artisans. For a traditional art form, the geometric patterns still feel temporary and bold.
So this logo is selected through a competitive process specifically targeting young people, and it reflects the conference's basic principle of inclusion and our desire to raise HIV awareness among our youth. I'm pleased to recognize the designer of the winning AIDS 2016 logo, John Hanawalt, is a 30-year-old artist from San Francisco in the U.S. I want to thank him and congratulate him and ask him to come to the stage. Is your certificate, and I think we're probably going to have a photo op.
We're very proud of your design, John, and I hope all goes well for you. Next slide. Okay. Minister of Health, Dr. Aaron Motsoaledi, the Premier of KwaZulu-Natal, Ms. Willis Nkunu, the MEC of Health in KwaZulu-Natal, Dr. Sibongiseni Dlomo, the Mayor of eThekwini, Municipal Councillor James Ngumalo. Some of the honored guests that are here that I just want to recognize is Mr. Mangosuthu Buthelezi, who is the Member of Parliament, Minister Shabangu, I'm not so sure if she's still here, the Deputy Minister of Health, Dr. Joe Pahla, and Ms. Faith Mtambi, Minister of Communication, I'm not so sure if she's still here, Premier Ace Makashule. We thank you, all of you, for being here, and Deputy Minister of Social Development. All protocol observed if I didn't follow it exactly as I would normally do. 16 years ago, Nkosi Johnson was the voice of the vulnerable young people who tried to capture our attention. Let us for one moment imagine what may be going on in this space today. We take a peek into heaven, and we see Nkosi sitting next to former President Nelson Mandela, watching us. How will they react to the progress that has been reported thus far? They will certainly not jump out of their seats and dance with joy. Smile, they certainly will. We came here to talk about access to HIV prevention, treatment, and care. We came here to talk about equity and human rights. And we came here to speed up the pace, to demand change now. First, with respect to access to HIV prevention, treatment, and care, there's significant progress towards eliminating HIV transmission from mother to child. In addition, there is progress in developing biomedical HIV prevention interventions such as medical male circumcision, PrEP, PEP, and condom distribution. While the biggest challenge facing the conference in 2000 was access to AIDS treatment. The biggest challenge facing AIDS 2016 conference is the relentless spread of HIV, especially among young women. 3 studies by Caprisa were presented here with new information on high rates of HIV infection in young women in South Africa, resulting from the cycle of HIV transmission, which involves age-disparate sex. The other 2 studies provided evidence of 2 vaginal bacteria, one increasing HIV vulnerability, and another undermining the efficacy of tenofovir-based topical pre-exposure prophylaxis. These results provide new direction on how to slow new HIV infections in young women. We probably all agree that an HIV vaccine remains the best option for HIV prevention. 2 important developments in this area are the results of phase 2 trial of candidate vaccines from the Thai vaccine trial, with some adjustment from the local subtype C strains, reach a go threshold to proceed to a larger trial for efficacy. The new hope that broadly neutralizing antibodies may protect against HIV has reinvigorated the AIDS vaccine research. Studies of VRC01 are underway to assess its ability to prevent HIV infection. Many presenters indicated that there is impressive progress on ART scale-up, which leads to increased life expectancy and in many cases to a reduction in new infections. The general view is that this is not time for complacency, as much more still needs to be done to end AIDS. For example, while mothers are accessing ART, their children and adolescents are less likely to get it. While women are more likely to access ART, men are less likely to do so. We need to develop strategies to increase ART use in children, adolescents, and men, and therefore reduce mortality in these groups. Now, to achieve increased access to ART will certainly require that we develop innovative HIV testing and prevention tools. The Test and Start program in Thailand, which relied on key populations supported by healthcare workers to implement the program, serves as a very good example. Turning these key populations to become community health workers has been shown to be an effective intervention to increase HIV testing in Thailand. Indeed, the introduction of massive numbers of community health workers will get us closer to reaching our 90-90-90 targets. With respect to cure, steady progress is being made, but there's no clear approach that has been found as yet. Shot and kill remains the favored approach, where resting CD4 cells are shocked with drugs to identify infected cells, which are then killed with ART. My second point is that we came here to talk about equity and human rights. Participants clearly articulated their concerns for inequity and violation of human rights. Black people of African descent, the MSMs, the sex workers, injection drug users, transgendered people, intersex people, and prisoners are discriminated and often pushed to the fringes of society, increasing their risk of HIV. Chris and I call on the LGBTI and the women and girls to stop working in silos. We must not allow funders and program planners to divide us. We must be treated as one group that is at high risk of HIV. The social and behavioral scientists have to make progress in researching and developing effective interventions and strategies that address the triple challenges of gender, race, and class. They are called upon to tailor HIV prevention interventions to each one of the high-risk groups such as the Black people of African descent, the LGBTI, injection drug users, sex workers, and prison population. My third point is that we came here to speed up the pace to demand change now. There was a clear recognition that we cannot accelerate change in reducing new infections, increasing art, reducing stigma and discrimination, and against unless we reconceptualize our strategy to be that of ending social and economic justice. We have to ensure there is justice. We need to heed the call to start a social justice movement that aims to reinvigorate the HIV response, similar to the global anti-apartheid movement that we had. We must collectively fight for the repeal of laws that criminalize injection of drugs, sex work, and homosexuality. We must demand the removal of policies that encourage discrimination against these populations. And this is certainly not going to be achieved without activism. A very big thanks to all of those activists who keep turning up the pressure for progress. All those who march for social justice need our support. Let's give them a hand. To achieve the goal of 1990, we'll need more funding. As we call for an end to AIDS, it was revealed here that donors and governments are reducing their investment for AIDS. We need to mobilize communities around the world to hold governments accountable to contribute to the full funding of the Global Fund. In the face of dwindling financial resources, we should be better advocates for resource mobilization, to ensure efficiency of the use of resources also, to allocate more financial resources to address the social, cultural, economic determinants that contribute to HIV infection based on people's realities and not on one-size-that-fits-all interventions. The funding for civil society who focus on the affected populations, often beyond the reach of government interventions, is critical. We cannot end AIDS without them. We need them. We must hold our governments accountable, especially African governments on the continent. Let us call upon them to introduce universal health coverage paid from domestic resources to finance health care, including HIV and TB. We in Africa must reduce our dependency on external resources. Let's prioritize our finances to ensure sustainability of healthcare financing. Let the international funding resources augment our own substantive contribution to financing HIV and TB services. At the beginning of the conference, my co-chair Chris mentioned the sizable presence of women presenters in this conference. What a pleasure to see you all women here. Like the gay, the lesbian, the sex workers, men who have sex with men, and the transgender community, and the black people of African descent, we know what it means to be discriminated against. Your presence here has filled the conference with a sense of liberation. To those of you who don't fall in this expanded definition of key populations, we thank you for the work that you do, and we hope you're going to continue to support these populations. Your skills, your energy, your funding, and advocacy are vital to the success of the struggle against HIV and TB. We are in this thing together. The theme of the conference, Access, Equity, Rights Now, is a rallying call for all of us to work together to end AIDS. If your batteries were flat when we started the conference, I trust the engagements throughout the week have reinvigorated you. I'm certainly fired up, as Michelle Sidibe was. I believe that we've been given some clear pointers on the way forward. You have once again confirmed that holding the conference here in Africa is the right thing to do, given that 70% of all people living with HIV, mostly people of African descent, call this continent their home. The city of Durban has a reputation for honest talk, for free expression, and robust engagement. As I hand over the microphone to my colleague, Chris Bayer, I'd like to say that it has been really a great honor and pleasure to co-chair this conference with you. Together we handled everything, the challenges and everything, and I do believe that we have really revitalized the HIV response, we have delivered good science, and we're refocused on social justice. To each and everyone in this room, I thank you for a successful conference. Let us go to our respective communities to turn the success of the conference into reality. We must organize, mobilize, use evidence, advocate, and act now. Famba ni kahle, go well.
The magnificent Olive Shoshana, the first woman from Africa to co-chair an international AIDS conference. Hi, everybody. What a week, huh? How was your AIDS 2016? Yeah. Olive, your leadership, vision, and heart really have made the International AIDS Conference return to Durban an extraordinary success, and our whole community is in your debt. And I'm personally profoundly grateful to have you as a friend and a colleague, and as I said, the first African woman to do this job. There are so many others, yeah. There's so many others to thank for a gathering like this, and it takes countless people and countless hours. But on behalf of the International AIDS Society, I really must first acknowledge the government and the people of South Africa. You have so warmly welcomed us to this special city and to your extraordinary country, and you're not moving the teleprompter fast enough, and there we go, okay. I really want to thank the U.S. government as well, and the U.S. NIH, particularly the Division of AIDS and the Office of AIDS Research. Your engagement and support has been extraordinary. And let me also acknowledge PEPFAR, the wonderful PEPFAR team, and the extraordinary leadership of Ambassador Debbie Birx. You made yourself available to us just tirelessly. You're still here at the closing. It's not easy to get an American ambassador for 10 days. Debbie, extraordinary. Let me thank our friends and colleagues from our 4 major industry sponsors, Gilead Sciences, Johnson & Johnson, MSD, and ViiV Healthcare, along with our other corporate sponsors, foundation partners, and in particular, I think the Ford Foundation, which was enormously helpful with our scholarship program, particularly so that people living with HIV could come from low and middle income countries and be a part of this conference. Thank you very much for that. We had an outstanding conference coordinating committee. We had skillful track chairs. We had 3 people whose services as scientific program committee co-chairs really led the effort to build this magnificent scientific program that the rapporteurs reported. Let me thank the rapporteurs and give you the names of those 3 conference co-chairs, Professor Ken Mayer, Dr. Steph Baral, and Dr. Koleka Milisana. Thank all 3 of you. Yeah. I must say, deepest thanks to our incredible IAS team. They've been, as you know, working around the clock all of this week to make all of this happen, and that team, of course, is led by Owen Ryan. Fantastic job. Owen, where are you? He's probably still working and running, but really, thank you. And I want to thank all of you, and I really want to thank all of you for still being here at this closing. This is the best attended closing I think we've ever had. There were 15,180 participants at AIDS 2016. Wow. From 153 countries. And that doesn't count, by the way, all the people who are in the global village. If we count them as well, we think we're well over 18,000 people who participated in this event. So really extraordinary. But I really want to thank you, the participants, for bringing your science and your passion and your commitment to Durban. I'm thrilled to say that the largest number of participants who attended this conference were from South Africa. And how great is that? And they were followed, yeah, indeed, and they were followed by folks from the United States, and then Zimbabwe, Kenya, and the UK. So, amazing. So Africa, we built it, and you came. We came to Durban this week with the goal of moving beyond rhetoric and the narrative of ending AIDS that prevents us from grappling honestly with the complex human realities and the scientific challenges of HIV today. Yeah. As everyone in this room has understood this week, I think a consensus has emerged that we are not done yet. We face enormous obstacles before we can truly contemplate the end of AIDS, and this conference has been an opportunity to have the tough conversations that are needed to overcome those gaps. And that, I'm pleased to say, is exactly what we've done. In scientific sessions at the Global Village that you heard about, through policy symposia and advocacy events, in dialogue with each other and with our precious friends in the AIDS fight, UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon, Bill Gates, Charlize Theron, Cyril Ramaphosa, Sir Elton John, Graça Machel, this year's IAS President's awardee Tony Fauci, and a new leader we were so delighted to welcome to his first IAS conference, Prince Harry. Let me also say we received a message from a longtime friend of our community who let us know on the opening day that she was with us all in solidarity as we launched this conference, IAS 2012 plenary speaker, Secretary Hillary Clinton. We've learned, it was lovely to hear from her, I must say. We've learned many things this week, and there are a few in particular that I'd like to focus on before we part ways. Immediately as this conference began, we saw the launch of the second IAS Global Strategic Strategy towards an HIV cure, and that really is a landmark and recognition of how far the cure field has been moving toward our ultimate goal. Throughout the conference, we were reminded that despite the great diversity of the pandemic, we really are in this fight together, and ensuring the engagement of men, straight and gay, in the prevention and treatment cascades really is critical, and that really emerged as a theme here in South Africa, but also in Baltimore, where I'm from, and everywhere else. Long-term retention in care, I think, really emerged as a serious threat among pregnant women with HIV, as we learned in the PROMISE study, among adolescents everywhere, for people treated earlier, and for our brothers and sisters aging with HIV and facing those multiple complex health challenges. And I think that was really a powerful theme of the science here. The first results of the SEARCH trial have pointed us toward better engagement with men happily through broad health services and broadening health services. And the amazing CAPRISA study of Slim and Qureshi showed us how important it's going to be to get men in their 20s and 30s engaged in care if we want to have an impact on women and girls. So that's a huge insight. There were some important cautionary findings too, and I think the ANRS Africa Center study showed us that improving ART access and coverage in high transmission populations may not be enough to reduce incidence at community levels, and that was really an important insight. The reality of sustained incidence in adults led us to focus a great deal of scientific attention at this conference on combination HIV and on PrEP. I thought Patrick Sullivan did a brilliant job summarizing that tremendous amount of science. We saw, of course, the first PrEP implementation data from Gilead on the first 50,000 prescriptions in the US, and we saw data from diverse populations, Black MSM in the US, women in Africa, adolescents, and the consistent outcome, I think, is clear that PrEP can and does work remarkably well in real-world settings for people at risk who adhere. The Partners PrEP study showed us that combination of TASP and PrEP can virtually eliminate heterosexual transmission. And the ANRS Hypergay trial, or Hypergay, showed the remarkable efficacy of on-demand PrEP in the open-label extension. And I think that really brings us to a question that Carlos Del Rio posed in his terrific plenary today. How would you like your PrEP? So in Durban 2000, we saw the beginning of the treatment access era. So I think we should come together as a community and say, let's take these compelling scientific results on PrEP and make Durban 2016 the start of the PrEP access era. And that's an applause line. Currently, PrEP coverage is very low, as we know, but UNAIDS gave us a target at this conference, and that is to provide 3 million people at higher risk of HIV with PrEP by 2020. So that is really wonderful to have as a target, and I hope we all can embrace it and endorse it. We know we have to do better, of course, for women and girls. We hope that DREAMS is going to help show us the way in the DREAMS countries. And we have to do better for young gay and trans youth with burdens of disease that should really be unacceptable to us all. While the contexts vary and the risks vary, we know after Durban that the challenges these young people face are profoundly shared. I think the evidence presented here in Durban is telling us that whether we succeed or fail in this epic struggle against HIV will depend on our collective ability to address the persistent and resistant obstacles we face. And I don't just mean the viral reservoir. I mean the continued failure to address the human rights and dimensions of the HIV epidemic. Those are the most persistent. The legacy of the HIV response is not going to be measured only in lives we save, but that's of course critical, but in the human dignity we've been able to restore. As Olive and I said at the opening, no exceptions. It's been an honor and a privilege to serve as IAS president for the past 2 years. It's really been one of the most inspiring and powerful professional experiences of my life. I'd like to acknowledge my team at Johns Hopkins, who've been incredible in supporting my term as your president. And if I may, I'd like to acknowledge my hugely supportive husband, Mike Smith, who's put up with my constant travel and all those working weekends. Thank you. Friends, I'm proud of what we've been able to accomplish together. This year we launched an ambitious new IAS strategy through 2020 that is clear-eyed, uncompromising, and achievable. I'm thrilled that the person carrying that strategy forward is one of the world's most dedicated and energetic HIV researchers, South Africa's own Linda Gale Becker. At the end of this session, in fact, in a few moments, she takes the reins as the new president of the International AIDS Society, and she's the first woman from Africa to have ever led this organization. If you know Linda Gale, and I know many do here, then you know that the IAS is in extraordinary hands. I was thinking about how to describe this extraordinary woman to you, and it came down to me to 2 words: compassion and creativity. This is a woman with a huge heart, especially for young people, and an incredibly creative and innovative mind. To have followed my mentor, the great Françoise Barry-Sinoussi, and now to be handing on the torch to Linda Gale Becker is just an extraordinary privilege. Linda Gale is Deputy Director of the Desmond Tutu HIV Research Center at the University of Cape Town. She's the Chief Operating Officer of the Desmond Tutu Foundation. She's a lead investigator on an incredible array of important HIV studies being conducted here in South Africa, including serving as co-chair of the big vaccine trial that was announced to start here soon, HVTN 702. She also has a long track record in tuberculosis research, which is going to be a major focus going forward for the IAS, and so we know that TB portfolio is in great hands. She is more than a world-class scientist and thought leader. She's been enormously influential in shaping the Durban Conference as president-elect. And I've seen firsthand how deeply committed she is to working with communities, those affected by HIV, and I am just thrilled and excited to see where IAS is going to go under her watch. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to IAS President Linda Gale Becker.
Thank you, Chris. Halala AIDS 2016. Halala. It is my great honor to be here with all of you at this wonderful conference as the incoming president of the IAS. It's an extraordinary privilege to serve the IAS and you, the HIV community, during this pivotal time in our history. Chris, I extend my heartfelt gratitude to you. You are a very special friend and role model. I've lost you now. There you are. And I know that many of you know that Chris Baira is an extraordinary leader and remarkable humanitarian. You are wise, well beyond your years, courageous, gracious, and someone who knows more about more things than anyone I know. You have also brought new vitality and focus to the IAS over the past 2 years, and I thank you for that. And you have been a wonderful friend and mentor to me. I know that I can continue to count on you, and I'm really happy that you will continue to play an integral part in the team going forward. Thanks, of course, to Mike for sharing you with us during what has been an incredibly intense 2 years. As we draw these amazing 5 days, plus several days of pre-conferences, to a close, a very special thanks goes to Olive, Memory, and the entire conference coordinating committee, the fantastic, smart, scientific, and community committees, and all who have contributed. Olive, Chris, you and your committed colleagues have worked tirelessly on the international conference return to Durban, and I know that everybody agrees it's been a phenomenal success. Halala AIDS 2016. I have to tell you, Minister, Government of KwaZulu-Natal, I'm very proud to be here, and I'm especially proud to be a South African today. So, how are you all feeling? I have to tell you, I have felt the energy and the excitement in the corridors of this center from early in the morning until late in the evening for the last week. I'm excited and optimistic about the future of the global HIV response. The scientific insights and programmatic advances shared at this conference provide powerful evidence that we can beat this. Every day we have seen community, science, policy, rights presented in extraordinary ways. Seeing young African men courageously declaring their right to love fearlessly from the stage, to the young people standing up and giving clarity to our response, to hearing about exciting breakthroughs and next steps in science and discovery. We have seen and experienced it all. Our challenge is now to translate the energy and outcomes of this conference into tangible action, to impact this epidemic in ways that are truly revolutionary. We must ensure that the time we've spent here this week is put to use in the real world and counts in terms of people's lives. From the second we leave here, the clock starts ticking again, and there's not a moment to lose. As Charlize, Chris, Olive, so many of our wonderful guests and great leaders have said this week, and I'm afraid I'm going to say it again, the work simply is not done. During the 5 days of this conference, 15,000 people living with HIV have died. More than 20,000 people with curable TB have died. And more than 28,000 have been newly infected with HIV, of which 1,500 were young people from this country alone. Carlos, this also makes me outraged and appalled, and I see no room for complacency. I know you are all with me on this. I've felt your urgent commitment, your devotion, and I know you to be some of the hardest working and most passionate people. You, like me, are determined to make a positive impact on the world, and make a difference we shall. As I view the next 24 months, I feel passionate about many things, but there are 3 things I want to call out today: youth, research, and resources. Several studies presented here this week show that unless we urgently step up our HIV prevention and treatment efforts amongst adolescents and young people all over the world, we risk HIV taking hold in a new generation. We urgently need HIV prevention and treatment programs that are tailored to reach young people. This includes services for young women and girls in Africa, but we must not forget young men and adolescent boys. We face the danger that they become the future blessers unless we intervene urgently during their youth. But also Also, we need programs for young gay, bisexual men, transgendered people, sex workers, people who inject drugs, and all the other wonderful people who've been mentioned in this conference, the young people who far too often are forced to live in secrecy, shame, and fear. In this regard, we also need to help and support our frontline team to get this job done. So a big shout out for our nurses and our community care workers. When we speak of putting human rights at the center of the HIV response, which Chris has done time and time so eloquently, we must include the rights of young people, particularly those in populations on the fringe. We must remember those young people who are also at terrible risk of tuberculosis, hepatitis, STIs, unwanted pregnancy, violence, poverty, and the loss of their dreams and their hopes. We will, led and taught by young people, continue to search for solutions and strategies that work for youth all around the world. Too often the research agenda is ill-suited to meet the needs of adolescents. Too often new prevention and treatment options are developed for adults without a plan for young people. It's time for a new research agenda that prioritizes the needs of today's and tomorrow's young people. And on the topic of research, as we step up our efforts to meet the needs of our young people, we must also accelerate the search for new tools for all populations, specifically improving and optimizing our prevention options, as well as moving as quickly as possible to an effective vaccine and treatment remission. Thank you once again to Dr. Tony Fauci and all those who represent the research endeavor. Thank you for being here. Your commitment to finding solutions is so valued. At the TB 2016 pre-conference, we heard of the terrible research gaps in tuberculosis, an ancient disease that we have long ago grown way too complacent about. We urgently need a catch-up strategy for TB that includes advocacy, research, development, and funding. Understanding the biology of HIV prevention, even as new ideas were presented at this conference this week, should continue to be on the research agenda. But I'm really optimistic about our future prevention revolution, with new biomedical, structural, and behavioral options that will allow young people, and particularly young women in this continent, to take control of their own sexuality. In the meantime, we don't have a moment to waste. We need to make tailored prevention combinations, including oral PrEP, accessible to all populations who need it. As I and others have been saying this week, I'm hopeful and determined that the Durban conference will be remembered as the catalyst for a new movement to expand combination prevention, including PrEP, both oral and topical, globally. My urgency is driven by the fact that, like so many of you, I have an adolescent who faces a too often cynical and unpredictable world. We want a safer, more just, more tolerant world for our children. Oliver, know that I love you, whatever. Be passionate about the people in the world you live in, and above all, always seek to make a positive difference. To Lois, Carlo, Brian, Michael, and all the youth that are at this conference and beyond, you are not the voiceless and the forgotten. You are our future. So much to do. We must not delay to the research to find an effective HIV vaccine, a task which has proven to be a challenge. I was thrilled and very proud to have been able to present VTN 100 here at Durban, which has paved the way for the launch of VTN 702, as Chris was saying, under Glenda Gray's wonderful leadership in South Africa. Halala Mzansi. Reflecting on where we are in understanding what will take to find a cure for HIV, I also take a moment to pay a special tribute to the remarkable Françoise Barré-Souissi, who will step down as immediate past president today. Françoise, you have served the HIV community unbelievably well, and we know you will continue to help to search to solve this problem. So I have outlined a pretty big to-do list, and none of it will be possible without the third factor, shaping the future of HIV, that being resources. Without sufficient funding, we won't be able to do the work at hand, to address the needs of young people, or continue the quest for new scientific breakthroughs. We're at a particularly critical moment for the future of funding. You've heard here time and time again, the Global Fund is reaching out to donor governments for its next replenishment. This is what it comes down to. Whether people live or die in many countries will depend on how donors respond to the Global Fund's call to action. Lives depend on the Global Fund. PEPFAR, the United States' extraordinary contribution to the global HIV response, is up for renewal in 2018. I take a moment, and I particularly look at Ambassador Birks now, as a member of this region, to acknowledge the generosity of the American people and the many lives that have been saved through your generosity in the last 16 years. Let's support Ambassador Birks, and it's really critical that the next US president and Congress recommit to supporting and expanding PEPFAR's work in Africa throughout the developing world. I want to thank the leaders in these efforts who've attended this conference: UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon, Ambassador Birks, Mark Dybel, Uncle Mark, as he will now be known forever, Michelle, health ministers, ministers and ambassadors. Your presence here underscores the concern and the urgency of the situation. We've heard so much this week about competing priorities, many very significant global emergencies. We've also clearly heard the real concern of civil society, under threat due to competing priorities. In this uncertain, tumultuous world, we heard also this week from UNAIDS and Kaiser that there has been a decline in major government funding to HIV in this last year. We urge all those who can influence this to do so in the name of humanity and a better world. So what can we do? I ask each of you to recommit today to advocate and to act. AIDS 2016, join me, let's roll up our sleeves, take the best evidence we've heard here, get back into the clinics, the laboratories, the homes, schools, communities, and commit to make the greatest possible difference in our daily work. Together, our actions will move mountains, they will save lives, and they will make history. Whether you're a frontline healthcare worker, a researcher, a minister of health, your individual day-to-day actions contribute to the ultimate mission to win the battle. You have found your voice in these halls. Let's take that voice to the streets and corridors, to all the corners of the world, that all may know that the fight against AIDS is far from over. Don't forget to sign the second Durban Declaration. It reflects a clear pathway for our response to HIV until we next gather at the AIDS community in Amsterdam in 2018. Access and equity will not be realized unless we pay more than lip service to human rights. In particular, like Chris, I want to thank those who came as guests to our conference. Your presence shines a light on our cause. Thank you to the grandchildren of Elizabeth Taylor, the grandchildren of Madiba, Charlize, Peter Durgay, Sir Elton, Princess Mabel, Prince Harry, Bill. Your presence here lets the world know our cause is worth fighting for. HIV is fundamentally a political issue, and it needs an even stronger political and human rights response, which we at the IAS promise to help drive until we next meet. I acknowledge the commitment of the IAS Governing Council, representing each of you in your regions. Je suis IAS, People, science, progress. So, as we approach the final moments of the International AIDS Conference, and it is bittersweet, this return to Durban, already we look to the future and begin the march to Amsterdam, where we will reconvene in 2018. I look forward to welcoming you there with my very great friend, ally, and co-chair, Peter Rice, who you'll hear from a little bit later. Peter is a doyen of HIV, but also an extraordinary, wonderful human being. Also, welcoming you in Amsterdam will be the new IAS president-elect, and I'm happy to announce Dr. Anton Pozniak of the Chelsea and Westminster Hospital in the UK. Anton, also a greatly respected HIV-ologist and an all-round expert, as well as you discovered this week as being funny and very dedicated to the HIV mission. Anton, it will be a great, and it is a great pleasure to have you working even more closely on the team going forward. Finally, I thank Owen and his stellar team at the IAS for all the hard work they put in always. Not only for this conference, but to ensure we have an AIDS society we can truly be proud of. Continue, please, to be members. Together, we are an unstoppable force. And lastly, I thank the Arch in the past and count on his awesome support and prayers going forward. I appreciate the Desmond Tutu HIV Centre and Foundation who back me 100%, and the important love and partnership I found in my husband and family. I'm truly incomplete without you. I'm confident that by the time we reconvene in Amsterdam, we will see the fruits of the magic of Durban 2016, and we will be well on the path to writing the second and final chapter in the history of the end to AIDS. I love you all, and I thank you for being here. But it is now my very great honor and pleasure to introduce a man I respect and also love, I have to say, a great deal for the work he's done. He's the South African Minister of Health, Dr. Aaron Motsoaledi, who since 2009 has reinvigorated my country's response to HIV. He too is a man on a mission, and the mission he has is a healthy and hearty South Africa. Please join me in giving Dr. Aaron Motsoaledi a warm welcome.
Co-chairs of the 21st International AIDS Conference, Prof. Shisana and Chris Bayer, the incoming president of the International AIDS Society, Professor Linda Gale-Becker, my colleagues in cabinet, ministers, deputy ministers, premiers, and MECs, members of parliament from all over the world, especially from the continent of Africa, distinguished delegates, good afternoon. On behalf of Deputy President Cyril Ramaphosa, who sends his sincere regrets that matters of state have denied him a wish to be here today, I wish to thank you, every single delegate and every participant and every presenter. Your presence and contributions have ensured that this conference was both a huge success and another pivot in our response to the HIV and TB epidemics. I am sure you will all join me in thanking our hosts, the International AIDS Society, the conference co-chairs, Professor Baer and Professor Shisana, and their team for a wonderful, well-organized conference. Please give them a big round of applause. Durban South Africa and the world will remember your contributions towards ending AIDS by 2030. The success of the conference is illustrated by the participation of civil society, people living with HIV, key populations, scientists, and policymakers. It is clear that without strong civil society participation, we will not win the battle against HIV and TB. We have heard from the rapporteurs the key take-home messages from AIDS 2016. Among them are the following, and I'm going to mention 5, not in any order of priority or significance. 1, sustainable financing. Although significant progress has been made, there is so much more to do to fast-track our response. Countries will require resources to scale up, introduce new technologies, and expand services. This is not the time to decrease or withdraw funding from countries that need it the most. To ensure that nobody is left behind, we must advocate for resources. A fully funded global fund is critical. Our response to the twin epidemics of HIV and TB must be front-loaded. 2, meeting the UN high-level meeting targets. We must work much harder to reach the targets that were adopted during the UN high-level meeting in New York in June. The targets are ambitious, but with determination, resolve, greater efficiency, and additional resources, we can and we must reach them. 3, leaving no one behind. Expanding access to the most vulnerable and marginalized populations is central to our goal of ending AIDS as a public health threat by 2030. We must continue to advocate, agitate, and convince government to understand this. Our understanding of leaving no one behind means that there must be no exclusions at all. Race, gender, social status, sexual orientation, age, and any other criteria cannot be used to exclude anyone. We cannot talk about ending AIDS if we continue to exclude other people for whatever reason. In South Africa, our constitution enjoins us to respect the right of all. We will continue to uphold this principle and urge others to do the same. It is quite disturbing that we have to keep repeating this because the preamble to the newly adopted Sustainable Development Goals pledge that no one will be left behind. In addition, the Sustainable Development Goals consistently refer to the word all, meaning that nobody must ever be left behind or excluded. All member states have adopted these goals, and therefore, we must all be guided by these principles which underpin the Sustainable Development Goals. Number 4, reaching children, adolescents, and men. It is clear from the deliberations at this conference that we must do more to reach children, adolescents, and men. In hindsight, the 15-year program of the Millennium Development Goals did not pay specific attention to adolescents, and yet this is the most vulnerable time in human development. We must correct this as we embark on the next phase by putting adolescents and young people at the center of the response. With respect to HIV, we need to strengthen the management of transition from pediatric care to adolescent health services. The continuum of care must follow life cycle approach. Adolescents and young women continue to bear the brunt of the epidemic. New HIV infections in the 15 to 24-year age group remain unacceptably high. We have to design multi-sectoral programs that address the needs of young women. We must confront the fact that men are considered to be vectors in the HIV transmission. Therefore, we cannot leave them out of our programs. We must find innovative ways to reach men. Men must be supported to define their needs so that we structure programs that are responsive to these needs. Men need to see themselves as part of the solution rather than part of the problem. Number 5, strengthening the management of the TB, HIV co-infection. We need to strengthen the management of TB, HIV co-infection, especially in sub-Saharan Africa. In the words of our icon, Nelson Mandela, and I quote him, "We can't fight AIDS unless we do much more to fight TB as well." These two diseases are two sides of the same coin. In this regard, I would like to congratulate the Global TB Caucus of Parliamentarians, an international network of members of parliament with support from 100 countries seeking to contribute to ending the global TB epidemic. 1,400 parliamentarians have already joined this caucus and have signed a pledge. Please allow me at this juncture to acknowledge the presence in this gathering of Prince Mangosuthu Buthelezi, the longest serving and eldest member of the Parliament of the Republic of South Africa. He was the first member of Parliament who followed Madiba's example to declare that his own son also died of AIDS when it was not fashionable to do so. The African chapter of the Global TB Caucus was launched during the TB conference, which was convened over the weekend. I would like also to congratulate the organizers of this conference for having allowed a TB conference to take place just 2 days before the International AIDS Society conference. Needless to say, it is for the first time that this was happening, and it's quite encouraging. Organizing the conference side by side will bring the community fighting TB and HIV/AIDS together. Ladies and gentlemen, to achieve the ambitious targets that we have adopted, we cannot afford to be complacent. There can be no end to this epidemic if we are complacent. So say no to complacency at this moment. On behalf of the people and government of the Republic of South Africa, I wish to thank you for coming to Durban. I wish every delegate well as you travel back home and hope that AIDS 2016 will help us individually and collectively to fast-track the response to AIDS epidemic. Please say no to complacency. That's very soft, it doesn't show commitment. Please say no to complacency. Thank you very much. I'm pleased now.
And now to give the Community Partners Address, please welcome to the stage Duncan Mogetsi, Svetlana Moroz, and Gennady Rashupkin. Svetlana Moroz is an HIV-positive women's rights activist from Ukraine and chair of the Eurasian Women's Network on AIDS. Duncan Moagetsi is an advisor of the Global Network of Young People Living with HIV/AIDS and a board member of the National Association of People Living with HIV/AIDS in South Africa. Gennady Rashupkin is a gay activist openly living with HIV for almost 30 years. He is a member of the MSMGF Board of Directors and co-founder of the Eurasian Coalition on Male Health, a network of LGBT community and MSM service organizations in Eastern Europe and Central Asia.
Excellencies, esteemed colleagues and friends, allow me to acknowledge the activism that happened throughout the conference this week. The presence of the civil society was strongly felt. I am delighted to be invited to speak at this ceremony of the 21st International AIDS Conference. I would like to take advantage of this opportunity to express my deep thanks to all of you who descended to eThekwini this week. And thank you, Durban, for being generous to us all. Sibonga kakhulu. As AIDS 2016 draws to a close, I'd like to take a moment and consider our activities and achievements over the past few days. I am a person living with HIV. I belong to a population that normally does not attract much attention. I have lived on the margins of the society, often shunned and left in the shadows. I speak for those who are isolated, alone, first-hand targets of social exclusion, and those who the climate of constant fear, hate, and profound social oppression hits so hard that it takes away our fundamental human right, including the right to health. During the past few days, we have heard that our interventions have fallen short as stigma and discrimination in all forms continue to bear down on women, men, youth, and children living with HIV. As a society remains silent about the persecution that transgender people, men having sex with men, sex workers, and people who use drugs continue to face every day. We have heard that we urgently need to break down the barriers that prevent people from accessing the care and support to which they are entitled. We have listened to many presentations, speeches, and statements over the past week that emphasized our moral obligation to build the HIV response on a solid foundation of equality and dignity for all, to constantly fight for the rights of our people, to reach out and meaningfully engage communities who most bear the brunt of the epidemic. In the words of Justice Edwin Cameron, who was with us this week, I quote, he says, "Dealing effectively with HIV does not mean only science. Grateful as we are to the scientists and doctors, it also means progress in our communities and societies to break down long-standing prejudices, hatreds, and ignorances. Only when scientific advances are meshed by social and cultural progress can this epidemic truly be contained. Despite our progress, our response will continue to fall short, while stigma, discrimination, and gender inequality still persist. Indeed, there is so much room for improvement, and we certainly need to speed up the pace. Nonetheless, this week we have heard that there is renewed commitment to support our efforts. However, This will be meaningless unless we ensure continued funding, including investment in a fully funded global fund. As we make our way home, let us build upon the discussions that we've made, the partnerships we have cemented, and the relationships we have formed here. As we back to the programs we run, the research we conduct, and the people we care for and serve, I challenge you all today to continue to fight for the rights of those who are pushed to the margins of society. No matter the focus of your work, this is not someone else's job. It is all of us. The task fall to us is to make political, social, economic challenges necessary to enable this to happen, to ensure that we all have the same opportunities as everyone to live healthy, dignified, and fulfilling lives. We cannot ignore the plight of LGBT people, especially trans women, who are 49 times more likely to be living with HIV. It is totally unacceptable. Before I hand over to my colleague, I would like to extend my deep gratitude to all who have contributed in the success of this conference, especially the representatives of the civil society, for helping the voices of the most vulnerable be heard throughout this conference, and those who spur us to action. Friends who come from near and far, go well, hambani kahle, samang handle. Thank you very much.
It's very excited to be here and breathtaking. I thought today that the end of AIDS is on our mind, first of all. For how long we can tolerate victimization? What an odd word, victim of AIDS. It makes me so angry when I read about the new concept dedicated to victim of AIDS. Many of people who have died of AIDS did not give up until the last breath. Many AIDS patients have survived. I was 19 years old when I was diagnosed with HIV. I was pregnant and using drugs. Later on, I have learned about hepatitis C as well. I started my ARV treatment when I only had 90 CD4 cells. There have been many miracles in my life. This is why I survived. And also because I did not consider myself as a victim. 15 years ago, a good psychologist taught me that living with HIV is just not a fight with virus. It is to live with the social status of HIV-positive person. For how long we will tolerate the criminalization of people who use drugs, sex workers, people living with HIV, men having sex with men? Criminalization is killing us by limitation of our access to HIV treatment and prevention. It's also so much more expensive if you can do a simple math. Instead of keeping people who use drugs in detention or in prisons, invest in harm reduction, opiate substitution treatment, and rehabilitation. And you will save much more money and save much more lives. In my own country, Ukraine, I have heard many times from the patients living with HIV when they talk to the doctors and social workers, I'm not a drug user, I'm not a sex worker, I'm not a prostitute. Treat me well. This argumentation makes me so angry. First, because it's a situation created when we need to use this justification, and the second, because the arguments underline the selectiveness of the value of the people's life. And unfortunately, it's clear manifestations of stigma prevailing not only in our society, but within community of people living with HIV. Still, we all know that many women who do not use drugs have anal sex, and men who have sex with men and sex workers use drugs. For how many more years we have to demand for funds for treatment for all? This is not just financing. This is major investments in healthy and prosperous society, and is major indicator of value of human life being life. I have beaten up, I have been threatened to be raped. I have been raped just because I am a woman living with HIV and woman who use drugs. When you think the conversation around gender inequality are overestimated or exaggerated, just take a moment and watch the line of visitors to female and male prisons. You will be bored at women's one. Won't be many persons standing here. While at the men's, there will be a queue of variety, people who would be transferring food, medicine, stuff, willing to marry, to have sex and just talk. While the world celebrates declining rates of new HIV infection and death from AIDS, in Eastern Europe and Central Asia region I'm coming from, the only region in the world that did not achieve the 6 Millennium Development Goal. New infection and AIDS-related deaths continue to grow. HIV drug resistance, tuberculosis, and hepatitis C epidemics remain concentrated among key population. Civil society, communities, networks in Eastern Europe and Central Asia draw your attention to the catastrophic situation in our region and solutions that would enable us to catch up to the rest of the world on the track to move towards ending AIDS by 2030 and achieve sustainable development goals. We often use the word fight, battle, struggle when we talk about AIDS. I don't like these words. It brings a sense of destruction. Instead, I want to build, to create, to develop my future, my relations with people, and my relation with the God. Please support me and a million people of living with HIV all over the world. And finally, I cannot restrain myself to say to my friends from Ukraine, Україна, ти в моєму серці. Клуб «Світанок» – мережа позитив-вімен, позитивні жінки. Щиро дякую вам, що я досі жива, щаслива, і в мене все є. Thank you very much.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It is a big honor for me to speak to you today. I want to start with gratitude to International AIDS Society. How many of you are presented in the hall? Please raise your hands. Not many. Thank you. I want to thank Government of South Africa and all donors of this conference. Thank you very much for very, very rich program. Thank you for comfortable venue and very kind and helpful team of volunteers. You did it, and you did it great. It looks like this conference happens on an age of significant change. HIV and TB clearly recognized as a global health and economic threat. We have quite detailed vision of desirable future. We have an impressive set of technologies and tools to cope with HIV and TB. We perceive power of our diversity and build strategic coalition. Gay men, drug users, young women, researchers, policymakers, and many others. Now we're working together, and we already started very hard and even very painful for community organizations dialogue on who will pay for our joint victory. Money is crucial. Peter Piot said on one of the conference sessions, do not expect miracle if there is no money behind, and he's right. The next conference will be in Amsterdam, a capital of country well known for its liberal attitude to needs of any person, as well as for intention of use resources smart and of maximum efficiency. As a gay man living with HIV for almost 30 years, as an activist of my community, as a citizen of my country, I wish we will discuss in Amsterdam such things as results of universal access to testing and treatment, sexual education in schools, how to do it better, not how to start it, how to do it better, PrEP availability for those at most risk. I wish to see there top officials from post-Soviet republics and countries of Islamic world routinely discussing improvement of national public funding for lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender community organizations. So, keep calm, fund the Global Fund, and make this world yours. Thank you.
Please welcome to the stage the local conference co-chair for AIDS 2018, Professor Peter Rice.
Wow. What an honor it is to be here in Africa on this stage and introduce myself and introduce Amsterdam. It's wonderful to be in Africa because Africa is a continent where I had the fortune to spend part of my childhood and grow up and know what it is to mix with anyone and become a global citizen. And I will always be very, very grateful for that time spent here. It's also a terrific honor to serve as the local chair, of course, for AIDS 2018 when it comes to Amsterdam in 2 years. But first, thank you, Olive, Chris, the entire conference coordinating committee, all program committees, the IES staff, the volunteers, the presenters, and especially each and every one of you, the delegates, for such an inspiring week in Durban. But also thank you to Durban, the people of Durban who have been so hospitable. Everyone I met has been so nice, so helpful, and it was really, really impressive. And I can only hope that we will see the same in Amsterdam. We have big shoes to fill in 2 years' time in Amsterdam, but together with our new South African president of the IAS, my colleague and friend, Linda Gale-Becker, we will do our very best to fill them, and I'm sure Linda will make sure we fill them. I cannot stand on this podium here in Durban without acknowledging the giants of human rights, so much connected to this city: Nelson Mandela, Mahatma Gandhi, Nkosi Johnson, and again this week in the plenaries, Justin Edwin Cameron and his godson. Each and every one of us, as well as each of our civil society, political, religious, or any other kind of leader, can only do justice to their legacy by acting as true global citizens and take whatever action, and I repeat, whatever action, is required to end intolerance towards and achieve equity for every single human being living with or at risk of HIV. We simply owe our giants of human rights no less. Only then will no one truly be left behind, and will we be able to reap the benefits of our remarkable scientific advances to end AIDS and achieve an AIDS-free generation. Let us challenge ourselves that when we meet in Amsterdam in 2018, we can share the progress of our collective actions. We invite you to bring your best science, your most innovative and effective actions to implement, as well as your strongest voices to Amsterdam. In addition to great people, the next conference also needs a great new logo. I'm very pleased to announce the AIDS 2018 Conference Logo Design Competition. It's open to all individuals between the ages of 10 and 30. Contest guidelines and information about how to submit the logo designs are now available online at the AIDS2018.org website. The deadline for entries is October 1st. The designer of the winning logo, just like we saw this evening, will receive a trip to Amsterdam to attend the conference in person along with a friend, where he or she will be recognized in a formal presentation. Finally, on behalf of our Amsterdam Planning Group, I invite you to watch a short video in which Amsterdam looks forward to welcoming you without restrictions, anyone who wishes to attend the conference in 2 years will be welcome. Thank you very much.
I had one brother who died of AIDS in 1992. I've learned that it should always be out in the open to treat people in an open, harmonious way.
I don't think we in the Netherlands realize sometimes how lucky we are that we live in a country where we have human rights, that our rights are respected.
Spinoza was a very important philosopher in the 17th century. He was the advocate for the freedom of religion and freedom of speech. And there's a wonderful quotation of Spinoza on this statue that goes, "The goal of the state is freedom."
Harm reduction is part of that. You need to be tolerant to accept that certain groups have certain behavior. An example of harm reduction is how we help the drug users.
You know, when you want to tackle a challenge as enormous as HIV and AIDS, nobody can do it alone. And I think in the Netherlands, you see how government, the scientists, the NGOs, those living with HIV/AIDS, all work together.
From the scientific perspective, people involved in basic science, in social science, in clinical medicine, but very importantly also involving the affected communities into both the design as well as the execution of the research.
You can learn from each other, and every organization can bring their expertise into the project.
The Amsterdam mentality is about openness and inclusivity, and I can give you some examples. The tolerance is also very important when it comes to coffee shops, when it comes to sex workers. Everyone knows these phenomena exist, and I think then it's very important that you're open about it. Then you can try to normalize it. Actually, this is an Amsterdamish way of dealing with problems without denying that sometimes they are problems.
Most of the people with HIV can live a normal life in the Netherlands. Jobs, do sports, all social activities when they live with HIV. And in the Netherlands, it's often not a big problem. It is, however, to tell people what your status is. We are protected by law, so we don't have to. But sometimes it feels better to tell people.
In work and also in school, my friends are really tolerant about me telling about it because they feel like I'm really honest to them. And when they feel like they need to ask me something about my HIV status, they come to me and ask me questions. And I'm really glad they do that because it makes me feel like they accept me for the person that I am.
Maybe that's sometimes forgotten in the message around science, that it's all about people. Everything we do ultimately has to do with individuals and people who each of whom deserves to lead a healthy life and lead a fulfilling and productive life. Well, as a scientist, I hope that we'll be able to, first of all, set up a dynamite conference from a scientific perspective where really high quality science is being presented across all domains of science, but also at the same time I think we need to capitalize on the conference being in Amsterdam to gradually move to the situation where HIV is being considered as being far more normal than it is today, and also be able to reduce stigma.
To all the people from the Congress, I want to tell them that I really appreciate them being there, and I really want to encourage them reaching to a world where people with HIV can live without fear and without shame and feel like they're accepted by everybody.
I hope that it will provide a platform for all of us to learn from each other and to collectively think how we're going to create that world without AIDS. I look forward to welcoming all of you in Amsterdam. And together, we can make it a great conference.
Ladies and gentlemen, this concludes the closing session. Thank you for joining us at the AIDS 2016 conference.
Thank you.